And
we will have a range of speakers in this first session, but before I introduce them, I do just want to do just a few bits of housekeeping, not expecting a fire alarm. So if they do hear one, we do need to exit via our fire escapes to the nearest muster point. If anybody needs the facilities, the men's toilets are on this floor at the end of the corridor. The women's are either upstairs or downstairs. And just to say, there are some copies of the Resilience of Multiculturalism here. Oh, Troy's welcome. That's great that you're here already. Welcome. We're just making a start. These are just for you to have a look at. They're not really for you to take away. So if you could have a look at them, share them, be inspired to purchase it at a later date, that would be fantastic. So that's what they're here for. So it's with great pleasure that I welcome you for this afternoon's events. This is the first session, which is looking at the Ethnicity Centre and its Diaspora. So that's the first hour and a half before we move into the book launch event. And I'll be chairing this. We've got contributions from a range of Tariq's collaborators from various points in his career and journey. And we've got audio and video contributions from colleagues as well as in-person contributions. So let me just tell you who we're going to have speaking on this session. We will hear from Professor Steve Fenton, who's Emeritus Professor at the University of Bristol, and he was one of the founding assistant directors for the centre. So we'll hear a little bit about the centre's prehistory and what came before and led up to the creation of the centre and some of the legacy that made it possible in a sense. We'll hear from Steve shortly. We'll then hear from another Steve, Steve May, who's now a professor at the University of Auckland, and he was a co-founding editor of Ethnicities and also one of the co-organisers of the first conference with Tariq and myself. So we'll hear from Steve Fenton and Steve May. And then we'll hear from a slightly, maybe a different generation, if I can put that way, of scholars and collaborators in the form of Nasir Mir, who's at the University of Glasgow, and Varam Oberoi at Loughborough University, who are both co-editors of the Palgrave book series. So people who have led to the creation of the centre and then in some senses been enabled and facilitated to have their careers developed through it. And very importantly, Therese has also joined us, and Therese O'Toole is going to talk to us as both a centre member and the head of the School of Sociology, Politics and International Studies within which the centre is located. And we'll go in the order. We'll have the contributions from Steve Fenton and Steve May, and then we'll go to Therese, and then we'll have Nasser and Varan, if that's okay. And I'll just include some brief reflections myself before I go to Therese, just on the conference and the centre and thoughts about the future. But let me, before we do anything else, let me just see if I can ask if we could maybe show the video, audio, please, from Professor Steve Fenton.
If you're live on the other side, can you hear us if we talk?
Don't know whether he's joined on.
Right video.
I'm Steve Fenton, Professor Emeritus of Bristol University. The Bristol interest in what was once called race relations stemmed largely from the work of Michael Banton. In 1967, he had published his text on race relations, the first in the field in the UK. I arrived at Bristol in 1969, and in the 70s, the master's degree in race relations was initiated, and for a time, the social science research unit in race relations, later ethnic relations, was situated at Bristol under Michael's directorship before it later moved to Warwick under John Rex. I personally had initially no special research interest in ethnicity, at that time being interested in individualism and communities. but I was drawn into the master's course to teach comparative race relations, largely based on my knowledge of the US present and historically. On the whole, the Department of Sociology was sceptical about the value of the field, and Michael aside, and to a lesser degree myself, the field did not feature as a central interest of staff who were largely interested in questions of political economy. A few years after Michael Banton retired, I became head of department, and in the various reviews, such as research assessments of the department, I was advised that the department lacked a central focus and one that would be marked by the presence of a centre for research in a leading field. From this time onwards, I made it a priority to try to rectify this. Rohit Bharot and I had already run a number of conferences under the title of an Ethnicity Centre, and thus ethnicity was clearly a candidate to meet this need. The department also lacked professorial staff. I was a non-professorial head at the time, and subsequently we saw the appointment of two in the same appointment process, Gregor McLennan and Tariq Modood. The appointment of Tariq made the creation of a centre based on ethnicity a real possibility, and in 1999 it came into being. A few years later, Jon Fox was a very important addition to the department and to the work in the field of ethnicity and nationalism. The centre grew in numbers of people attached to it and in the volume of research being carried out. A big turning point came in 2003 when the centre successfully bid for a Leverhulme programme grant, which underpinned a host of research projects over the following years. For myself and Robin Mann, now a reader at Bangor, the programme made possible our research into the sentiments and politics of the ethnic majority and national identity. The research was subsequently the basis of a continuing series of Mann Fenton publications in the area, and in 2017 we published Nation, Class and Resentment, The Politics of National Identity in England, Scotland and Wales through Palgrave. I have no doubt that the centre has been a success and will continue to thrive. Newly emerging topics demand to be investigated, most notably the rise of populist nationalisms in a number of European countries, including Britain. Where these nationalisms form parties, they're beginning to have success, as the recent Thuringian elections demonstrate. Even where nationalist parties have not been created, the mix of national identity, anger, and resentment are playing powerfully into national politics. Much of this, of course, is directed at new migrations. I suggest that this combination of social class, migration and populist nationalisms should become a primary focus of our research. This would link the centre to important strands of social theory and practice and would connect the centre analytically and sociologically to the department and school in which it sits.
I think he's finished. That's great. So that's fascinating reflections from Steve, and many of you who have known the school, the space and the Department of Sociology before will recognise that history, and I think it's really important that we're reminded of the important contribution of Michael Banton, Steve and Kelly in creating that reputation, indeed, you know, the sense in which Bristol was already known as, the Bristol School of, ethnicity and studying of race was already established when the centre was created. So really important, I think, reflection on that heritage and tradition. I'm going to now ask if we can play the video, and it is a video this time, from Steve May. And just to remind you, Steve is at the University of Auckland, and he was a co-organiser of the very first conference back in '99 and the co-founding editor of the journal Ethnicities.
Greetings, everyone. For those of you who don't know me, my name is Stephen May, and I'm at the University of Auckland in Aotearoa, New Zealand. But of course, my connection here with you today is that I was also at the University of Bristol for nearly a decade over the course of the 1990s. I returned to New Zealand in 2001, and it's that time that I want to talk about today. I was a lecturer throughout most of the 1990s, and my office was on the third floor, the top floor of the then sociology building at 12 Woodland Road. And when Tariq came to Bristol, he ended up in an office adjacent to mine on that floor, a much larger office, I might add, than my tiny cubicle. And I only mention his office size because no matter how cavernous Tariq's offices are, they're almost impossible to negotiate because of the piles of papers and books that are on the floor. No doubt nothing's changed there. But I digress. What I want to talk about today is really the conversations that Tariq and I first had on that floor around his plans for the centre and some of the related developments that arose out of that as a result of our conversation. I want to talk about two in particular. The first was the idea of a specialist conference hosted by us, by the sociology department at the University of Bristol at the time, a signature event in effect that would bring together interdisciplinary scholars from around the world, working on ethnicity, nationalism, racism and anti-racism, and of course multiculturalism, among other related topics. And it's from that initial conversation that Tariq and I had that the conference came about, entitled Ethnicity, Nationalism and Minority Rights, in which Tariq and I developed along with Judith Squires and co-convened in 1999. And it's at that conference, of course, that the centre was launched 25 years ago. What was also significant about that conference, though, were the keynote speakers that we not only invited, but somehow managed to secure. And they included, of course, Bhikkhu Parekh, Will Kimlicka, the late Iris Marion Young, Craig Calhoun, and Jan Nedovine Pieterse, among others. And it was a hugely successful conference, a great profile for the department at the time. And as I said, was also, of course, the forum where the centre was formally launched. And that brings me to the second and related development, which was that while we were organising that conference over the course of 1998 and 1999, Tariq and I also simultaneously went about pitching a new interdisciplinary journal to publishers. And we had seen a gap in particular at that time in Sage and Sage Publications journals in terms of promoting an interdisciplinary journal which we entitled Ethnicities. And Sage were convinced by arguments, and Ethnicities was also first publicised at that conference along with the launch of the centre, although its first issue didn't come until a year later at the start of 2001. And Tariq and I have co-edited that journal ever since that time. And just as a link back to the centre launch and the conference itself, the first issue of Ethnicities foregrounded a colloquium that included many of our keynote speakers, and along with a number of other luminaries in the field, looking at the key issues of the day at that time in relation to issues of ethnicity, nationalism, minority rights, multiculturalism. And just for those of you, those keynote speakers who were there then and are still here now, just a heads up that we're wanting to revisit this colloquium next year when the journal turns 25. So we'll be in touch with you shortly. Anyway, Tariq, I know that the success and influence of the centre is squarely the result of your vision and drive concerning it over so many years. And for me personally, it's also been a pleasure and a privilege to have continued to work with you so closely with the journal, with Ethnicities in the intervening years. So all the best, and thanks for the opportunity to talk with you all today. I also look forward to being back in Bristol early February next year for a WN funded multinational project on linguistic racism in higher education, which will be hosted by the centre and Jon Fox in his new director's role. But hopefully, Tariq, we can also catch up in person again then. So thanks again, everybody, and all the best for today. And as I said, greetings from from New Zealand to you all. Cheers.
Thank you very much to Steve. Fantastic that we've still had a contribution from Steve, and that the ongoing collaboration between Steve and Tariq has stood the test of time, quite significant time, and is still looking forward to new publications. So I'm going to take a few minutes now just to add a few reflections of my own, if I may, as somebody who joined Tariq and Steve to organise that conference. I did actually have the privilege of sitting on that appointment panel that Steve Fenton just mentioned when we appointed both Tariq and Gregor McLennan, along with Sir John Kingman, who was the then Vice-Chancellor. We were seeking a Professor of Sociology at the time, a very general post, and we had two such outstanding candidates that we were determined not to miss the appointment of either, and we created a special post. This was atypical. Even then, I created a special post so that we could appoint Tariq to what is possibly the longest job title that anybody had ever claimed at the time, but was very descriptive of the breadth of the expertise and interests that Tariq brought to Bristol. I'd already known Tariq through the Oxford Political Theory conferences, that were annual conferences where we had first, I think, encountered each other. But what was very clear about Tariq then was that he was not only a political theorist who came from a very rich tradition of political theory, but somebody who was absolutely committed to empirical research. He was working in policy at the time when he applied here, and to being a public intellectual, and to really thinking about public engagement and spanning that, the theoretical and the empirical and the engagement. And that was a distinctive kind of facet of what Tariq brought to bear, and it was evident right at that first appointment panel, and it's been evident throughout. And I do think that that really, more than anything else, has set the sort of tone and flavour of how the centre has shaped itself, and I hope will continue to operate in future. We did, not long after Tariq joined us, decide to organise this conference, which was, I think, in retrospect, hugely ambitious in terms of the scope of kind of people that we wanted to invite, the breadth of expertise they brought, and the kind of stature they had. And you can see that in inviting Will Kimlicka and Iris Marin-Young, as well as Craig Cahoon, and Bhikkhu Parekh and Stuart Hall, that some of that mix is there. So we had social theorists and political theorists. We had people who were really engaged in British political discourses, their work on identities and sociology, as well as kind of more comparative political issues. And that breadth there, I think, was what was really distinctive. And I actually think, in retrospect, that's what encouraged so many really leading scholars to come, because I think they were interested in each other, and bringing them together was quite a distinctive facet. And if anything, I think the conference exceeded our expectations, although they were very high, because the calibre of the debate was huge, the participation was very significant, and I think it really did establish a new range of discourse. I think that kind of the gathering together of the contributions that Iris Marin-Young was making with Will Kimlicka brought together some of those discussions from feminist political theory and issues of multiculturalism in really interesting ways, to kind of juxtapose issues that may not have come together in quite the same way had they not been gathered at that point in time. So I do think it was a really important event. It was always, as in anything when you organise conferences, it was also practically quite challenging. I can remember having quite heated conversations with some of our participants from Eastern Europe, I think, who could not believe they had to go outside the hall to smoke a cigarette. So there were all of those logistical challenges that come with organising a very large conference. But it did lead to the creation of the journal. And one of the things that, and the creation of the centre itself. And so if I just reflect on the achievements of the centre that was a legacy from that conference, the first thing that I think really strikes me is precisely the word of the new collection, which is resilience. I mean, this centre has been going for a very long time, when it is quite common to see quite quick turnover of academic entities and projects and centres. You know, you see things come, establish themselves, kind of dissipate, move on. You know, it is quite unusual, I think, to have something that was created in 1999. We have seen 3 VCs since that point, since the John appointed Tariq. We've seen 3 further VCs. In fact, the country's seen 8 prime ministers, and we still have Tariq as director of the centre. So I think resilience is something to be celebrated, but also just to reflect on what that tells us about that kind of continuity. It obviously suggests that the issues and challenges being explored by the centre have not only gone away, they have become more pertinent than ever. So there is still a real need for the intellectual agenda that the centre is addressing. And I think we should celebrate the fact that the centre it really mapped out and identified an area of study that has become much more significant and mainstream internationally than it was at the time when it was created. But I think it probably also means that we should celebrate the resilience of Tariq, because there is a certain sort of interpersonal skill that Tariq has fostered, collaborations that have really stood the test of time. There are some long-standing collaborators, including people who are contributing to the book and joining us today, that have found collaborating with Tariq continuing to be intellectually challenging and rewarding, and have therefore continued to engage. So I think that I would commend Tariq's personal resilience as well as the centre's. I do think that the centre has achieved an international reputation. It has, as been said before, frequently kind of generated the idea of there being a Bristol school. And that is such an asset for Bristol as a university and a city, to have such a strong international profile, for having identified this juxtaposition of work on multiculturalism, religious identity, Muslim minorities, governance, citizenship integration, ethnic inequalities. This cluster and the particular approach that's been taken, I think, has been really distinctive. And as I said, I think it is that combination of research into political discourses and socioeconomic structures that Steve Fenton spoke about, with the interest in everyday practices and culture, which I know will continue in the future under John's directorship, and with the drawing in of normative political theory on the other. I think this is really distinctive, and I think that if anything, it's that kind of methodological kind of eclecticism which has been so rich, and I think is quite distinctive to the Bristol School. The legacies of the centre are rich. They obviously take the form of the journal, which is still highly, high impact factor, highly cited, continues to get very high quality publications, and the publications. But I would say probably the most important legacy of the centre to date is the PhDs and early career researchers that it's produced. I think if you look around the School of Tariq, it is evident. You can see it in our speakers today, in Thomas, in Varun, in Nasser, in a wide range of people whose careers were forged in the centre, and who have taken many of those insights and taken them in their own directions and travelled with them. But the ripple effect of that learning and that framing of issues, I think, has resonated more widely, and that will just continue. So I think that's the most exciting of the legacies of the centre today, and I hope that we will continue to build on. And as we think about the centre, I'm really pleased that Jon Fox, is the Director Designate, who will be taking on. I think I was also on your appointment panel, Jon, as well. So I'm very excited that Jon is taking up that. And you'll all know that Jon has also done hugely significant work on nationalism, ethnicity, racism and migration. So nobody better placed really to pick up that baton and carrying it on. As Steve Fenton said, I anticipate that there will be a whole range of areas where we see real continuity in issues in terms of what's explored. Migration is inevitably going to continue to be an important focus, and and I think it will require cross-national, multinational comparative projects, as we've seen in the past, and I think there'll be need for that given the rise of populist nationalism across Europe and beyond. I hope that the Centre will retain that focus on developing new theoretical frameworks as well as successfully enabling public intellectual engagement. I think it'd be good if we could retain both of those. And I wonder too if the next phase could think and reflect on something about a focus on cities, which I don't think has been a very large part of the agenda today. And I say that just because I was really taken with, you remember Benjamin Barber's kind of statement back about a decade ago that democracy is in trouble. And he says we live in a 21st century world of interdependence and brutal independent problems. And yet when we look for solutions in politics and democracy, we're faced with political institutions designed 400 years ago. And that is a real challenge for us. And thinking about what we can do about the dysfunctional political institutions, the archaic political institutions, with the kind of a complexity of current challenges, Barber argued that it's time to start talking about cities. Urban areas, he said, after all, are the place in which civilization and culture were born, the home of public spaces of culture and protest. And I was reminded of that this summer in early August when Bristol witnessed violent and anti-immigration riots on Bristol Bridge in the heart of Bristol. And I was also kind of reflecting on it when we also witnessed the citizens of Bristol coming together to express their solidarity with our diverse communities and asserting pride in being a city of sanctuary. And I thought this was a really interesting, visible moment where cities were negotiating some of the challenges that we have been grappling with in theoretical and a way in terms of a national challenge. And so I wondered if there could be space for focusing on cities as key sites for negotiating the challenges and opportunities presented by both migration and nationalism as my suggested new emerging theme that you might want to consider, but I'm now looking at John rather than. But let me hand over now, if I may, to Therese, who has been a member of the Centre for a significant period of time and done many of the research projects that sit within the Centre's auspices.
Thank you very much, Judith. And yeah, thanks very much for those reflections. That was so interesting.
If you sit in that seat, people online will be able to see if the cameras.
Okay. So thank you very much for asking me to come along today, Tariq, because it's quite a special moment in the history of the Centre, both the 25th anniversary and also the kind of transition to the new director as well. So it's really nice to join here. So I've been in, so Tariq asked me to offer some personal reflections on my experience being in the Centre. So I joined the Centre in 2008. I came from the University of Birmingham. And I think one of the reasons why I was really drawn to Bristol, there's lots of wonderful reasons to come to Bristol, but the Ethnicity Centre, I think, was a primary draw for me, particularly in the way in which the intersecting concerns around ethnicity and citizenship were expressed within the Centre. And I didn't see a formation of that type anywhere else in the country. So that really, I think, spoke to my own interests around, race, ethnic, religious diversity, governance and political participation. So I thought it would be a really ideal place for me to come and carry out my research, and I think that transpired. So quite quickly on coming to the Centre, of course, I knew Tariq's work and the impact that it had on arguing for the proper recognition of ethnic and religious identities and the study of inequalities and identities, and his work on multiculturalism. So I was really pleased when I came quite quickly. We were successful in bidding for a large project in the ESRC AHRC Religion and Society programme to set up a project on Muslim participation in contemporary governance. And that project brought together a team with Nasser Mir, Dan DeHannes, and Stephen Jones. Fantastic to have you here. The Bristol Diaspora has been known to set up that project. And I think that project, I think it's fair to say, was the biggest and the most systematic study of state-Muslim civil society relations then, and I think still to this day, I don't think there's been another study that has gone in such rigour and such scale looking at the evolution of state-Muslim relations, both at national and at local level. And indeed, we were very interested in cities in that project because we had 3 case studies of local level engagement, which we compared with practices and policies at the national level. So we had Dan leading on the Tower Hamlets study, Stephen Jones on Leicester, and I led on the Birmingham case study. And we looked at how local and national models of engagement differed or converged. And I think that was a really interesting study, particularly in the way we were able to trace some of the kind of evolving relations between government and Muslim civil society organisations, particularly drawing people's attention to the kind of pluralisation and maturation of the Muslim civil society landscape. In using a term from Tariq, is the growth of the democratic constellations of Muslim civil society actors that were increasingly being brought into governance spheres, particularly under New Labour, kind of surviving the coalition's big society approach, unfortunately going to the bit of the roadside under the Conservative government, where a much more securitised and exclusionary kind of dynamic began to set in. I hope that changes under the Starmer government, and that's something about that kind of tradition of really bringing civil society organisations, particularly the recognition of faith as an important vector of civil society engagement, back into governance and into kind of policy making under the new government. So I think that project was really formative for me as a researcher. And I think it was hugely beneficial to have conducted that work in terms of with such an amazing team of researchers. And it also led to kind of legacy, of additional projects that came out of that. So Tariq and I were also involved in another project that took some of the insights from that large Muslims and governance project to the study of Bristol, and to look at the kinds of ways in which the local state engaged with Muslim civil society actors. And again, in that project, what we saw there was, as in the larger Muslims and Governance project, was a kind of track record of really interesting local level innovation in the ways in which the local state engaged with Muslim civil society actors, sometimes in ways which were very much at variance and what was going on nationally, and sometimes in spite of national policies, and sometimes, and often typically, especially as we moved through to the coalition Conservative government, in the absence of any funding from central government. So I think that kind of insight then, really helped us to kind of figure the scope for local innovation, creativity, and also Muslim agency in those governance networks. And we were also able to build on that project to create Public Spirit, which was another AHRC project, in which we took very seriously the importance of having a space to talk about religion in public life, and particularly to think about the kinds of contributions and importance of minority religions in contributing to the debate on religion and secularism in public life. So the team, the Muslim Participation and Governance team, came together to create that portal, and we were able to create a kind of ongoing series of events, workshops, and online kinds of debates from both academic and non-academic contributors, and which was a very strong kind of presence and contribution of people speaking from minority religious perspectives. So I think that was quite important, particularly in terms of the kinds of debates that were going on around faith in public life at the time, that the perspectives of Muslim, Hindu, Jewish, Buddhist speakers on these really important questions about religion and public life had a space to be articulated. And again, I think that's also influenced my work since then. So that time, it's quite similar in lots of ways, that project, but it also influenced the work that I did taking on Birmingham, looking at the insights around Muslim state engagement in Birmingham, with the work that I did with John Homewood on the Trojan Horse Affair, which some of you might know was blew up in 2014 when there were allegations of Islamist conspiracy to take over some schools in Birmingham. And in that book, we argued, very strongly that there hadn't been a kind of conspiracy to take over the schools, and in fact there had been a grave miscarriage of justice in the ways in which the management of the schools were taken down, and with the Ofsted inspections. But also, drawing on the work of Tariq and others, we also concluded that actually what we saw in the picture in those schools were pictures of very successful schools that had worked very hard on creating an atmosphere and a curriculum and a school space that allowed for the articulation of pupils' religious identities within the school. And that had been really instrumental for the huge success of the school in significantly raising the educational attainments of the children in those schools, and that, you know, notably followed decades of poor performance and poor outcomes for children in those schools. So in that book, you know, we concluded is, perhaps coin a phrase we thought is multiculturalism works. And I think that's kind of, you know, important, the kind of legacy or reflects, you know, a lot of the kind of work that has been going on within the centre. So that conclusion, I think, that it really does pick up on the legacies of Tariq's own work on multiculturalism, but also I think a lot of the themes of research within the centre, because I think what that has done has provided a kind of really rich foundation of rigorous theoretical, as Judith said, that's kind of notable, the kind of theoretical advances, but also rich empirical research, and that have really sought to address the challenges of governing diverse society and providing these insights into more productive and successful ways of living together. So I think as we move into the next phase, that finds a really strong foundation for the future of the centre, because of course the complexities and challenges of governing and living in ethnically diverse societies are of course still with us and changing in form and direction in many ways. So lots of the themes of research that we have on migration, Sam, Catherine, on equalities, with Saffron, and of course fraught debates around national identity reflected in the work of John. I think means we're very well placed to go into the future to continue to engage in rigorous and interesting ways with those questions. So my capsule summary is, you know, much achieved and much to do. And I just like to say, you know, and as with my head of school hat on, is to mark, acknowledge, and also thank Tariq for the work that you have done in founding the centre and also establishing it with the kind of status and profile and contribution that it has achieved over the last 25 years. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Therese. And I'm now going to ask Nasser if he'd like to join us at the front. You all know that Nasser's now at University of Glasgow, and he co-edits the Palgrave book series, and is also one of the editors of The Resilience of Multiculturalism.
Thank you so much, Judith. So thank you so much for the invitation to speak, and it's nice to see so many friends and colleagues and former colleagues here. So I don't know if we settled on a collective noun for the centre Diaspora. I think the Bristol School's still in contention, but it's good to be counted amongst you, whatever we call it. I just have some personal reflections, really, given that I did my PhD here with Tariq, and then my postdoctoral work here with Tariq in the early noughties. And whilst I moved on, I think the centre very much followed me, not least in something of a teacher's voice that I occasionally hear. I don't often listen to it, but to the extent that, you know, we all live our life forwards and only really understand them backwards. I think an important part of what's been, you know, my professional journey was formed really here in the centre and my time working with Tariq. And it might seem minor, but the first thing to say is that I have very fond memories of working with friends and colleagues in the centre. You know, friendships that have endured. Sorry about the money I still owe you. And a sense of a community that was anchored in. And, you know, that might seem trivial, but I don't think it's unimportant, because I'm yet to meet a person of colour working in UK higher education who isn't hyper-vigilant. And the reasons for that surely reflect, you know, the sense that some bodies are more out of place than others, and that people are more visible sometimes and invisible other times. And that wasn't the case here. That wasn't the case here. I arrived, you know, in my early 20s, in the shadow of 9/11, during the creation of Prevent, you know, attended the first of many funerals of multiculturalism. And all of that stuff was being worked out through the centre intellectually in terms of policy discourse, because much of it was proximate to Tariq's work, but it was also of interest to all of us. And we were all kind of in dialogue with it in different ways. The centre was simultaneously kind of a shield and a platform to many of us. It offered a kind of a generative freedom to question that state of affairs, perhaps even to alter the conditions in which, you know, they come to pass. But it's also because it was a generous community, you know, despite the gradations of our professional standing. I think I was here when John arrived, showed him the ropes. But the PhD community was really nurtured and encouraged to speak up. There was this fine balance between having knowledge of the fundamentals and learning how best to disregard them, I think. And Tariq would much later, you know, when he talked about public intellectualism and about the role of universities as workshops for intellectualism, think about, I don't know if you thought that at the time, but subsequently it helped me understand what you were cultivating in this space, you know, encouraging us to think and engage, to ask big questions with famous people, and not be intimidated by that. But I think part of that, in addition, was also informed by the intellectual labour, the range of the intellectual labour in the centre. Now, looking back, I think that range was what we might call special, and everything would discourage or dissuade our students from doing today. It wasn't quite, you know, hunting in the morning, fishing in the afternoon, and talking, criticising after dinner. But, you know, it took me from trying to reread Hegel's master-slave dialectic, Hegelian phenomenology, through the prism of Du Bois, to being sent off to interview a young David Lammy for a project we were doing, and then on to EU consortia type research, cross-national, multidisciplinary inquiry that had their own vernacular, work packages, milestones, deliverables, technical summaries, lay summaries, dissemination, mitigation, all of that stuff. I mean, but it demystified what research is and could be, and was in its professional guise demanding of us, and it was exhilarating, you know, bringing together researchers with ideas, with questions and methodologies. And I think one thing I took away from that was not to be intimidated or defeated really by research applications, yeah, which, you know, is easily done. They can be exhausting, demoralizing, especially when they're unsuccessful, but they can also be a source of energizing and building community, even if they're unsuccessful. And that encouragement to kind of view inquiry as something as a knot to work at creatively, to reveal concepts in practice and the possibilities of approaching questions and problematics, both on their own terms, but also in how they connect to other concerns. I think it was very much a characteristic of the centre and my time in it. I think it cultivated a number of, let's call them virtues, a number of virtues that have never left me. So here's a few of them. The one is that theory needs to be more than a vehicle than itself, and that we should guard against the vice of a kind of a detached validity. I think that's something which is really important to embed, I think, when you're thinking and learning and nurturing thinking in terms of the limitations of, especially in social sciences, what theories and concepts can do in and of themselves. A second was that, you know, if you want to change the world, engage with the world, political efficacy is not just one action, but a strategic field that requires knowing how to speak and when, how to act and when. And don't presume that speaking truth to power just means one thing and treat institutions as if they're monolithic. The third was that I think as social scientists, our role is not only to critically examine the world. Research and data are important, but, you know, so are coalitions and meeting people where they are in terms of their objectives. And of course, you know, for academics, it makes sense that we should all believe that the weight of our scholarship will eventually make itself felt by some process of osmosis. But I think that, you know, the example of Fenton and Tariq's work was that that thing has to also be more than a procedural thing. It has to be something which is almost, you know, ethical in terms of being conveyed, knowledge that it's entangled with, you know, the fate of others, which brings its own responsibility. So yeah, at least 3 virtues taken from my time, and a lot more in terms of friendships and scholarship, and more broadly a kind of professional legacy for which I'm profoundly indebted. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much, Nasser. And then finally for this panel, Baron, would you like to come and join us? Baron Oberoi, who's at Loughborough University and also co-editor of Palgrave Book Series.
Well, firstly, thank you very much for this invitation. It's a delight to celebrate my mentor and friend Tariq and the centre that he helped found. I'm going to use my time to try and work out features of Tariq's intellectual character that drew me to him and the centre in the early noughties, about 2005 or so. And by character, what I'm really referring to are the tendencies and thought and behaviour that if Tariq wasn't exhibiting them, he wouldn't be Tariq. He would be behaving out of character, we would say. Okay. So for me, first and foremost, Tariq is a theorist. And he's a particular type of theorist. His PhD in philosophy really rewards reading. It's a very careful attempt to work out what a philosophical culture should be and how it can be defended. He's arguing with, but also against, Michael Oakeshott, and using R.G. Collingwood to identify a rapprochement between theory and practice. What's he doing there? I think he's probably asking the foundation question. What is the relationship between theory and practice? How that foundation question comes out in his character later is really difficult to tell, but I think it helped him to appreciate that being a public intellectual is a worthy thing with deep philosophical roots. But I also think his engagement with these idealist thinkers gave him an idea that has always helped me to make sense of him. And that's this idea that the idealists promoted, which is unity and diversity. Now, this idea of unity, I think I saw it the first time I saw Tariq speak, well, in an academic capacity at least, at a Cronum conference in 2005. I saw Tariq speaking from a perspective that wasn't just being a Muslim or a British Muslim or a minority group or a person of South Asian descent, but also an Englishman, a Brit, someone with profound connections to Wales. Somehow he was uniting these different perspectives, articulating these differences in one fell swoop. And so different groups could see different things in what he was saying and feel an attachment to his point of view. I think that helps to explain some of his, some of his success. But we see this unity and diversity elsewhere. When he talks about multiculturalism, I think there's so much that's distinctive in Tariq's work. In a beautiful piece in political theory, Will Kimlicka really accepts that his early work said very little about secularism and religion. Well, this is where Tariq starts, but it's not the only distinctive feature. When Tariq talks about English narratives and British narratives coming to include minorities, such that when we think of the English, we can think of someone like Tariq or someone like me, or someone like Nasser. But I think, again, what he's doing is saying that these differences can compile a unit or a group. They can have unity. These differences are not divisive. We need not fear them. They come together, form a whole. Later, I also came to see that he's doing something with unity and diversity methodologically as well. His intellectual work forces him to ask empirical questions, forces him to organize these large groups of disparate researchers who, without him, probably couldn't work together, and he somehow connects them, forces them to see different points of view and work together. I still haven't got a very good explanation for how he unites diversity in these different ways. But as someone who was doing their doctorate at Oxford on this concept of unity amongst culturally diverse citizens, and trying to work out ethically defensible ways, seeing him at that Cronum conference, it made me realize that I was pursuing a political unity and diversity, completely unaware of the British idealists at the time. I got this idea from Bhikkhu about unity and diversity. But Tariq was showing this idea at a much more fundamental level, not just methodological, not just doctrinal, but personal. When it came to pursuing a postdoc, I naturally came to him, and I think he forced me to see the importance of empirical work, took me in different empirical directions, forced me to see far more of what he initially saw in the British idealists, deepened my understanding. And I suspect this idea of unity and diversity is an unmentioned aspect of what Jeff Levy, who's joining us online, and we'll talk later, we would call the Bristol School. It certainly seems like an organizing idea in the centre. I think Tariq is unique amongst that generation of theorists that he's a part of for institutionalizing these ideas and projects on unity and diversity. I don't know others who have founded a centre that has lasted, as Judith says, this long. And I suspect he's laid down, as Therese said, very firm foundations. That doesn't mean it's over. He may be retiring from the centre, but he's still the headmaster of the Bristol School. He's encouraged John and myself, Nasser, and other members of the Bristol Diaspora to live up to the ideas that he began with, fought for, argued for. And for all that, I'm very grateful.
Well, thank you so much to our contributors to that session, including both Steve Fenton and Steve May. We've got a little bit of time now, if anybody would like to ask any questions or make contributions. I'll give you a minute to think. If you would rather do that informally, that's fine as well, but let me just see.
Everybody's too overcome with emotion. Articulate that.
No? Just checking if anybody wants to make a contribution. In which case, Tariq, did you want to say anything at this stage, having heard various contributions?
Well, I think someone has to say something. What are we going to do with the programme? There are various people who are only coming at 3:30 because they're only coming second part. That's true online, including presenters like Anna Triandafilidou, as well as people in Bristol. So please do say something. Yeah.
Break in the programme?
We can have a break. I don't know whether having a half-hour break is necessarily wise because people will be drawn to other things and may not come back. I mean, some of you I know have other things. You've already indicated that. So we certainly can have a break, though I think we don't need half an hour, and it might even be unwise to have a half-hour break. But
Tariq's worried people will wander off. I'm going to suggest let's take some contributions because I can see some hands going up a little thing, and we'll do 3 minutes, and then we'll give people maybe about a quarter of an hour to get a bit of fresh air, and then we'll come back for 3:30.
Oh, hi, yes. So I'm Catherine Charlesley. I'm a relative latecomer to the centre. I didn't get here till about 2009, I think. But I'd be really interested to hear from Tariq how you feel the centre has developed over that time and what you think the challenges are in the next phase of its work.
Can I ask a less cerebral question? Which is, the one thing I didn't mention well, one of the many things I didn't mention is that do you remember that time we got you in trouble with Policy Exchange? We got you on the front page of the Times. When they did that dodgy report, and Malaya Malik, myself and a few others wrote a letter and got you to sign it.
Yeah, I do remember that.
And you were never so popular. People loved you for taking on, you know, this academic taking on this this think tank, but you weren't terribly happy about it.
Yeah. Okay, so I'll say something about both of them. Maybe if I can come out a bit here. Yeah, I sit here. Well, let's take the letter about the policy exchange first. So policy exchange, who now of course are notorious right-wing think tank that are really responsible for quite a lot of the right-wing thinking, policy and practice around issues of migration, national identity, integration, and other issues as well. And I think Michael Gove was one of their founding people. Certainly he's probably the kind of the leading political intellectual light for them. So going back to the time that NASA mentions, was a much earlier period when actually very few people had heard of them. And one of their big kind of flagship things that got them quite a lot of publicity, including, you know, headlines in the Times, as NASA said, was that they wrote a report based on some focus groups, qualitative research and observation of Muslim communities in various cities like Birmingham, London, Bradford, Manchester, which came to the view that Muslims were a kind of reactionary, obscurantist, separatist force in British society. And that, of course, this is after 9/11. It probably was also after 7/7, if I remember correctly, but certainly at a time when security and international Islamicist terrorism was very much a headline issue. And that, so they linked it to that these inner city areas that they were surveying were feeding in to terror, destruction, and murder. Well, okay, so I didn't agree with that. So Nasser and Malia Malik, that I think at least some of you will know of, she's a professor of law at King's College, University of London.
It was more Malaya, but carry on.
Sorry?
It was more Malaya, but carry on.
All right, okay. And someone I know from when she was doing a master's at Oxford. Yeah, she's a good friend and contributed a good essay on race relations legislation within a kind of broader national imperial legacy in this book, The Resilience of Multiculturalism. So she was, of course, quite angry with them and said, Tariq, you must write a letter, or something, you must do something. And this does happen to me every so often, that my younger colleagues and mentees say, Tariq, you must do something. When I'm sometimes not prepared to do so. So as one or two people have mentioned, I am very keen on public engagement. I put it stronger than very keen, but I like to choose my moment. And I'm not very keen in intervening when something is a headline issue for a number of reasons. And this actually might be useful practical advice for other people. Perhaps you already follow it yourself. Firstly, as an unknown minor academic, you're likely to be ignored. So you're wasting your powder. Secondly, if you're not ignored, you're likely to be sucked into a very unpleasant debate that you'll never be able to get a foothold in or succeed in. So sometimes I'm invited to studio debates with people like Kilroy Silk, if that name still rings a bell. I don't know who the contemporary equivalents are, but they're basically shouting matches deliberately engineered by some TV program in a studio And you know, and sometimes I'm asked to this TV, GB News, to debate with Nigel Farage or whoever the leader of the Reform Party at the moment, something Pice is it? And I always say no, not because I'm not interested in public intellectual engagement, but I know that that is not a forum in which I will be able to present myself, i.e. say what I want to say, persuade anybody, I will be worsted. That's not my forum. So I rather choose my time and place. So going back to this letter, so Malhir got in touch with Nasser and I together or separately and said, we must do something. And I was thinking, well, now is not the moment. Yes, we should respond to their report. And I have actually at various times both seen some value in it and seen some shortcomings in it. And of course, the spin that they gave it. But I thought, no, I don't want to be sucked into this. So they said, Tariq, don't worry, we'll draft you a letter. All you have to do is sign it. And I thought, well, okay, all right, at least that'll get them off my back for a while. I said, yes, please go ahead and draft the letter. And they did. And I thought they would write some very long screed that no newspaper will ever want to publish because, you know, newspapers are obviously short of space. Now we've gone online. We're talking about the age of print media.
It's short and punchy, Tariq.
Yeah. So actually they understood that and they wrote a very short and punchy letter. I mean, probably only about 150 words. And the fact that it was punchy meant that it was saying certain things that I wouldn't wish to say in that kind of way. But I didn't want to argue with them about how to phrase things, and I certainly didn't want to expand it. So after looking at it a couple of times, and of course they were hurrying me, saying, you know, the deadline is so-and-so, because all these things have big deadlines, you know. The editor said to us, you must get it back to us by 4 p.m. You know? I'm thinking, well, all right, okay. So I agreed to sign it and sent it. And yeah, it got me into a certain amount of trouble. One of my best friends, Biku Parekh, said, I hope you've learned a lesson. Never put your signature to other people's letters.
We thought you equipped yourself very well then. How you responded.
Yeah, okay. So obviously I had to turn to your point, Catherine, which actually I've forgotten. What was it?
Well, I can take a minute to repeat it because it was quite a big question. I will just let everybody know that Halima Aslan has made a comment online saying, for me, Professor Modood, the most valuable contribution has been to give credibility to the term Islamophobia and its impacts. Thank you for such a positive contribution. So I thought I'd give you that, so you can be thinking about if you want to say anything about that. But then I'll ask you to talk to Catherine's question, which Catherine was about what Tariq thought might come in the future.
Yeah.
If you want to reiterate it for us,
Yes,
remind us.
how do you see the centre has developed and changed over its existence, and what are the key challenges for its next phase?
Yeah, thank you, Catherine. A very fair, if not an easy question. So this has come out a little bit in people's contributions, but perhaps not very explicitly, and so certainly some people may not be aware of it. And it's something I was actually going to say a little bit about right at the very end when I was going to hand over to John. But I know some of you can't be here at that point, so I'll say some of that now. Is that my intellectual background was in philosophy and politics. As Vara mentioned, my PhD was in philosophy, and it was really a kind of a methodological question that I was absolutely obsessed with, which was, what is the relationship between philosophy and politics? I.e., has philosophy anything useful to offer to us as political beings, as political agents, as a political society? And at one point I wanted to say no, but the more I thought about it, because I was very political and I was very philosophical, I wanted to say yes. And I had to find a convincing way of saying yes, and that's in a way what my PhD tries to do. But how that's relevant to your question, Catherine, is that I got into sociology. Yeah, take that chair. I got into sociology, and indeed whole field of racism, anti-racism, ethnic and racial questions, multiculturalism, etc. Not through a university course or courses, because I didn't do any of that work at university, and I didn't do sociology at university. I got into them really partly for being a brown British man. People were saying various things about Asians, about Pakis, if I'm allowed to use that word, about Black people and so on. And other people were saying other things back to them, which was, called various forms of anti-racism and Black power and so on. And I thought, well, they're talking about me, but I can't see myself and people I know. So it wasn't just about me as a lone individual. People that I know from family and community, I can't see myself in that barrage of invective and reply. So, and I was also unemployed. That's quite important because philosophy jobs ran out and I didn't get one. And so I ended up working in, I was doing voluntary community relations work at the time in Oxford. And I ended up in policy work at local government initially and then Commission for Racial Equality. But obviously I had a certain amount of intellectual apparatus, having done a philosophy PhD. So once I got interested in these questions to do with not being white or being white, being British, I then actually became quite obsessive about them in the way that I'd been obsessive about the themes of my PhD. I transferred my obsession to these questions and brought, the intellectual wherewithal from my PhD work to these issues. But I hadn't read any sociology. I came to read it, I ought to quickly say that. So I did read some, John Rex and Michael Banton and Stuart Hall and Robert Miles and so on. But much, much after I'd started thinking about these issues. So I started thinking about these issues in my own way, in a kind of combination of the kind of existential, big policy, discursive, rhetorical, politically charged issue, and by trying to bring those issues into a disciplined theoretical framework that would then be the basis for finding a voice of how to respond to those. So that's where I was, I suppose, in the 1990s. Then I was appointed, as Judith said, I was appointed here and set up the centre and so on. So I realized, especially talking to Steve Fenton, that he was hoping, in fact, more than hoping, it was kind of a expectation that I'd be doing a lot of empirical work and bringing in grants and things like that, which I was quite prepared to do because I didn't want to be an armchair theorist. I actually wanted to go out there and show that I was right. That what I was saying about Asians, about Muslims, about what it was to be British and what it was not to be British, and putting them into a theoretical frame that I started calling multiculturalism and continued to do so, that not only was this framing was right, but it could be empirically substantiated by properly framed empirical projects. I say properly framed because I wasn't very happy with the way that sociological research was being done at the time, because I thought the way they framed it always made the minorities defined in terms of racism and anti-racism. And that just wasn't right. I was interested in those issues, and I was interested in the political weight of those issues, but I wanted the minorities to have a certain weight, an empirical weight, and then a political weight, and a voice, a presence in the research, because I wanted us to have a presence in the country. So I set about, doing empirical work, and the framing, especially the philosophical background, really did become very backgrounded. It was implicit. And I would say it's just in the last few years that I've begun to gradually go back to some of my political theory roots, but focused on these themes, not in political theory in general, focused on basically the political theory of multiculturalism and other competitorisms. And I feel, having a certain amount of empirical, substantial grounding has helped me theoretically, but I also like to think I've made a contribution to a field that I was never really part of, namely sociology. And certainly the two things working together, I think have been something of a success. And I'd just also add that thematically, one of the great strengths of the centre, as I saw it and still see it in retrospect, was that we were amongst the first people to start talking about Muslims as Muslims and not just as brown or black people. And initially people thought that was mad. They thought, what are you doing that for? They also thought it wasn't politically correct. Loads of times I've been told it's reactionary, fundamentalist, divisive, this and the other. And I just thought, well, no, the minorities need to be a presence in their own way, in their own, for themselves, and not just as objects of racism or indeed objects of anti-racism. And I think that the centre has done that. And there was a time, I forget about when, but perhaps something like, 2012, 2015, when I looked around at what we now might call British Muslim studies, which, was just emerging. And I thought, actually, the people around me and myself, we are the single biggest critical mass of people working on British Muslim political identities anywhere on the planet. And of course, now that's taken off and it's a very, very big topic. And also we at the centre have diversified a number of other topics and so on. And finally, about where into the future you asked. Well, I'll be doing the same things that I've been doing.
There's the resilience for us.
What others are doing will be up to them. I suppose, obviously, what's happened over the last, 10 years or perhaps more, is that migration has really politically, intellectually, and in terms of research funding, swamped the whole field. So a lot of people think I work on migration, so I'm always having to say to them, no, I don't. I work on people whose parents and grandparents might have migrated, but who are not migrants, but who are marginalized citizens struggling for recognition and belonging. So that's what I'll be working on, but I know that a lot of other people are being drawn into, for political reasons, intellectual reasons, as well as simply career reasons, are being drawn into streams of work which give central space to migration rather than to minorities. Sorry about the very long answer, but at least I filled up the time. Yeah.
Oh, well, we've got lots of comments and questions. I'm going to go Saffron doing it. I just wanted to let you know that on the comment there are people really thanking you for the bringing together of philosophy and politics intellectually and institutionally, which is being pioneering and inspirational, and somebody who's saying just seeing a Muslim name on a reading list to make them feel that they belong. So all sorts of kind of comments coming in which respond positively to that kind of juxtaposition that you've talked about, some of it which was driven by intellectual determination and some of it serendipitous in terms of your career journey, but fascinating to see how that unity and diversity came to be. But Saffron, you had a question.
It's more about in terms of thinking about Tariq's contribution, actually. So I'm Saffron Carlson. I've only been in the centre for 11 years. I'm also a slightly odd member of the centre in that I'm not particularly theoretically focused. I will sort of dabble when forced, but mostly I'm an empirical sociologist. And obviously this Tariq's empirical contribution is something that's been touched on in various places. But the first time I saw your name and my sort of relationship from afar came through the empirical work. So I particularly wanted to mention, especially the Fourth National Survey of Ethnic Minorities, because that we, as somebody who has spent their career documenting and mapping ethnic inequalities, the drivers of ethnic inequalities, so not only that they exist, but what drives them and the importance of identity and racism and these structural factors. There was no data. My understanding is, there was no data to map any of this until that study through the Policy Studies Institute, another fantastic team of researchers led by Tariq. We can now say things about, and we started being able to say things about the nature of ethnic inequalities and the drivers of those as a consequence of having that data. There was a first national study and a second national, but it was only, I think, with the fourth that we really had the data to be able to say something instrumental. And not only that, the measures that were developed through that study have led in, they have had this really global significance. So they've fed into all sorts of really, big ethnicity studies in the UK, but through the New Zealand Health Department, anywhere they're doing like big ethnicity studies, they're drawing on the measures that were developed through that work. So we've talked a lot about the theory and those other contributions, but I wanted to really draw attention to that as well, because it really has sort of changed the world in that respect. So thank you.
Thank you very much, Saffron.
So we've heard about the empirical contribution, the public engagement ones, sometimes of your own choosing, sometimes not. And we've heard about the really significant theoretical and cultural and sociological contributions of you, Tariq. We've heard about your personal resilience and commitment to the centre as director for this whole time since 1999. And I think we've also heard a lot which makes us positive about the future and the next phase in the centre's life as John takes it on. So for me, that's been a wonderful session, including the early reminder from Steve Fenton about those kind of theoretical roots back in the kind of the work of Michael Benton, but also your own PhD and your work on Collingwood and Oakeshott. Wonderful coming together of all of those intellectual and professional dynamics which have made something truly distinctive, and I think we should all be really proud of, I certainly am proud of, to have something that's called the Bristol School, which has emanated through your directorship of the centre. So maybe we could all just congratulate Tariq and all of the other panellists today.
Thank you very much.
Well, we have, I think, just a very short break now, 5 minutes before we reconvene for the next session.
Okay.
Nice.
Just remind you, there are 3 copies of this book floating around the room.
On my phone with my timer on. I don't know. I don't.
You need to borrow a time. You're very well.
I've got a watch, but
Anyway, Thomas, over to you.
Okay, right, let's go. Firstly, I was going to say give my own apologies to Tariq as well as to everybody else. One, because I was late, and two, because I'm going to have to leave early, but duties and responsibilities demand me being elsewhere. So with that said, after that, I will be leaving you in the safer hands of apparently NASA, who will then be there to kind of navigate you through the rest of this session and closing remarks. I was going to say, I'm not going to speak for long. I'm just going to say a few words on the book, which is what this session is about. There are a few, where's the camera? This very smart looking volume. Yes, I'll just introduce that and then we'll get going. We've got a few of the chapter authors who will be kind of presenting on this stuff as well. So to do that, I'm going to start with the title. And I should say before I do that, that all title honours go to NASA, who has a gift for titles that neither myself nor Varun possess. And it probably still wouldn't have a title. But so let's start with that. So the resilience of multiculturalism is the title of the book. And as probably everybody here is well aware, multiculturalism for a long time, well, perhaps still, became a bit of a, what's the right way of saying it? Was not a very popular term. It became very unpopular, let's say, for many people in many scholars. It became highly criticised and seen as a bit of a problem, not able to respond to contemporary issues of diversity. For politicians and policymakers as well, of course, and very famously, David Cameron, Angela Merkel, Nicolas Sarkozy. It has been repeated many times since, including last year. So it became a bit of a word that was not to be kind of defended or spoken about. However, what has begun to happen despite this, despite the rhetoric, is a growing body of work is now beginning to show that this hasn't quite got it right. That multiculturalism, as an idea, as policies in legal frameworks and all this kind of stuff, is not only still around, but is very much an important part of the fabric of all of these things. So there's kind of a growing body of work that's looked at this in different countries and in different parts of the world now, and begun to make this point from slightly different angles, including a project that I worked on with Tariq and Pierre, who's also here. We've got a couple of articles that do that. To show that it's still there and these kind of things, but it's also still very present and still a very important part of the academic and the theoretical debate on thinking about diversity and minorities and issues of social and political pluralism and this kind of stuff. And this kind of brings us to, this is a kind of an important starting point for the book, which is, well, there's this resilience, the term is still there. And we want to try and kind of show some of why it still has such value and how it still exists and continues to be an important political idea. And so that's that first part of the title, but anybody who's got a volume kind of sitting around them, if you look on one of the inside, if you look on one of the inside pages, it's not just the resilience of multiculturalism, ideas, politics, practice, but there's a second kind of subheading, which is essays in honour of Modood. And a big part of the resilience of multiculturalism, or Tariq has been a key figure in that resilience. A very important figure in Britain, in terms of British, what we might call British multiculturalism or multiculturalism in Britain, but also in a kind of international sense as well. He has made important interventions and contributions to policy, And as an academic on various research projects, including the one I just mentioned with me and Pierre were both on, that was investigating this kind of resilience of multiculturalism, but also, of course, on developing it theoretically, defending it, but also continuing to develop it to challenges that have made in kind of to it by those who are more or less friendly, depending on where they sit in relation to their kind of critiques. So as you all already know and was discussed in the first session, Tariq's work on multiculturalism spans a range of disciplines, including political theory, sociology of ethnicity and racism, including within that contributions to thinking about multicultural education and the labour market, nationalism and secularism and all of these kinds of things. Of course, what holds it all together is multiculturalism. And the book, in many ways, is a testament to Tariq's scholarship, but also to his position in the field and how he is held, kind of with great regard and respect. The authors, I won't go through them all, a few of them are here, but we have, I think, a very eminent list of people who have contributed to it, people who know Tariq in different ways and have worked with him or engaged with his ideas in relation to their own work. And I think also another kind of slightly sideways testament is that even those who are very, very rejected, perhaps strong, but are very critical of multiculturalism, still see the need to engage with it as part of their own political and theoretical work. And we've got some of that in the book as well. So I'm not going to say more than that. I've probably already rambled more than I thought I was going to. But yes, so that's the book. And as I said, so the rest of this session, we've got 3 of the chapter authors who will be talking to you about their chapters. And otherwise, I hand over to Nasser and I will sneak up back. Simon, you're first.
Great.
Yeah.
Thank you, Thomas. Do I need to change seats? Is that
No, I think that's
for the video?
The camera has you.
Great. Thank you.
Yeah.
You need an introduction.
No, go on, good. So other people have already expressed their indebtedness to Tariq in a whole number of different ways, much more eloquently than I ever could. And Steve May said fairly early in the meeting that it was been a pleasure and a privilege to have worked with Tariq and be friends with him over the last quarter of a century. And I think I could do no better than echo those sentiments. Again, pleasure and a privilege to have known Tariq for this time, to have become friends, and then more recently to have become a co-author with Tariq as well. So I simply want to congratulate him on amazing body of work so far, and I, for one, can't wait to see what comes next. So I come to this as a political theorist just from one of the many things that Tariq does. That's very much my perspective. So in the chapter in the festschrift, which I was very grateful to have the opportunity to write, I regarded Tariq's work primarily as a political theory of multiculturalism. That's how I regarded it. And I wanted to try to understand how it's all various parts worked, how they operated together. And then in a more critical voice, I wanted to say something about how well it's all together and whether Tariq ought to be doing things a little differently or doing something in addition to what he already does. You click for me and then click again. So what I did was produce a series of slides summarizing my chapter in the festschrift, and I know there's no way I can get through all of this. So I'll just see how it goes. And if someone gives me like a 5-minute warning, because I'll lose track of time, that would be great. So I took as a guiding theme the notion of recognition itself, and then its place in a politics of recognition in Tariq's work. And this theme isn't hidden at all in Tariq's work. If you look in the index of his books, you'll find it all over the place. but I'm taking it here to be one of the central strands that pulls everything together in his work, specifically in political theory, but more broadly as well. And you can see in the middle of my introduction there, I suggest that it plays into or relates to or fleshes out his notions of equality, of identity, of struggle, of inclusion. So in the chapter, I look at the way in which recognition plays a role in those different areas of his political theory of multiculturalism. Before that, I just want to very briefly introduce the idea to people who may not be too familiar with it. You can click for me, please. And we use recognition in three distinct ways, I think, in ordinary English language. We identify things. There's Tariq. So I'm recognizing him, a person I've known before, and I re-know him again. You can also recognize in the sense of acknowledging a normative entity or an evaluative entity. You can recognize the importance of the right to freedom of religion. You can recognize the power of an argument for multiculturalizing secularism. That's the second distinct sense. And in the third sense that we may go to first when we're thinking about the politics of multiculturalism, we think of the recognition of persons, either as individuals or as members of groups. And those things can be complexly related, if you could click again for me. So for instance, identification isn't a purely neutral epistemic endeavor, whereas the third one is a normative enterprise, because actually identification and normative standing are complexly related very often. So when you think of contemporary discourses around immigrant or expat and so on, classifying someone as a person of a certain kind also has a lot of bearing on the sort of normative status that you give that person. So three senses complexly related. If you click again for me. There are also, briefly again, at least three strange features of this idea of recognition. And I informally invited Tariq in an email a week ago to have a think about those and to see if they could be seen in the politics of multiculturalism. So the first paradox, if it is a paradox, this idea that being recognized by somebody is only of value to you if you value that person. So if Tariq's work is praised by someone of high standing, that will mean a lot to Tariq. If it's praised by someone of low standing, then it will mean less to Tariq, all other things being equal. And here, we've already mentioned Hegel early on in the earlier session. Hegel says that there's something there about the necessary reciprocity of recognition. That in a stable relationship of recognition, each party must recognize the other. And Hegel puts it in this translation, each is for the other, what the other is for it. So is there something about the struggle for recognition and its necessary reciprocity that we can find in Tariq's work? The second one is famously found in Groucho Marx's comment, which in this version says, "I don't want to belong to any club that would accept me as a member," which is apparently in a resignation letter he made on a gentleman's club. So here the logic seems to be, I don't esteem anyone who would esteem me, which isn't a simple negation of the first paradox. And why does Groucho not want to be a member of a club that would recognize him? For some people, there may be an issue of something like low self-esteem. If you recognize me, you must be valueless, because otherwise, why would you recognize me? That might be the logic. I think Groucho is thinking slightly differently. He wants to be an outsider, to be disreputable, to be an iconoclast. So for him to be recognized will somehow harm his self-image of what he is like. A third version, and here I'm thinking of banner you see at Pride marches. We're queer, get used to it. In some cases, a person or a group may say that they don't want another's recognition. But there may be something a little bit paradoxical about that, because when you address that other group saying you don't want to be recognized by them, it's as if you're implicitly admitting that you really do, because otherwise, why would you bother to say to that group, you don't want their recognition? So there's something a little, let's call it paradoxical about that. Again, I wonder whether those two paradoxes have some sort of parallels in broader political struggles around issues like multiculturalism. Could you click again, please? So they're the four themes that I think each bear on this notion of recognition. So by looking at Tariq's theory through this lens, I'm hoping to cast possibly a new light on it, to reveal features that might not otherwise be readily identifiable, to identify the strengths of Tariq's ways of thinking, but also possibly to point to some of its limitations as well. You click again and then again. If I go to the first one of those themes and click again, I start with equality, and Tariq talks of this as his normative starting point. So for him, I would argue his political theory of multiculturalism very much starts from a notion of treating people equally. Notions of equality and equal citizenship are really the normative foundation of his thinking. And here there's quite a complex relationship between his idea of equality and notions of recognition. So on the one hand, he says here in multiculturalism that the idea of equality shapes the concept of recognition, because the concept of recognition is an interpretation of the idea of equality. In the second quotation, it seems to be possibly in reversed order, that here, to achieve equality, we must recognize people appropriately. So genuine equality requires sometimes treating people identically, but sometimes that equality requires the recognition of distinctive disadvantage or special need. So sometimes we recognize others as the same, and sometimes we recognize them as different. So in those two complex ways, we see that recognition plays an important role in that foundational normative concept of Tariq's thinking. And if you click for me again. Tariq says an awful lot of subtle and persuasive character about the nature of identity, and I can only touch on it very lightly here. But again, I would say that recognition can be seen to play quite an important role in this account of the identity of people, individuals and collectives. And I was particularly struck by his passage in the more recent book, where he talks about a kind of dialectical relationship between outside perception and insider identification, so that an outsider group will seek to impose an identity on an inside group. That group will sometimes seek to resist the imposition of that identity and assert a different identity, and that, of course, affects the outsider group. Thus, there's a dialectical struggle between the inside group and the outside group, so that recognition is fundamental to the forging of identities, all sorts of identities, including those pertinent to multiculturalism. You click again, please. And I've already touched on this notion of a struggle between an outsider group and an inside group, and the way that plays out in Tariq's work. But I think it's also important to say that the notion of a struggle for recognition is really quite a central notion in Tariq's thinking. So in my two little sub-theses there, recognition for Tariq isn't property of a static system. It's not a thing that can be achieved once and for all. Recognition is always an ongoing struggle. It's the ongoing achievement of a dynamic struggle. And again, I've chosen an illustrative passage which is intended to encapsulate this aspect of Tariq's thinking. That analyses should be framed in terms of a struggle for recognition, a struggle which is always ongoing, because novel moves can always be made in that struggle, opening up new lines of conflict. Aware of time, could you click onto the fourth slide? So if equality is the goal, and it's equality for people with a certain identity, and if people struggle to achieve equality and struggle for recognition, what's the end goal? What's the purpose of all this? What's Tariq's vision of the end state? And I think Tariq most often uses notions of inclusion to capture where this is supposed to be going, what the successful outcome of the struggle for recognition would be. So inclusion itself characterised in terms of recognition as I put it here. But because the struggle is ongoing, Tariq emphasises quite rightly, I think, with statement B there, parties can always challenge the rules of the game. So citizens have a right to be recognised, but they also have a right to debate the terms of recognition, to challenge the terms on which they are recognised. So it's not that I have to try to join in an already existing game and play by the rules, but my entry gives me the opportunity to actually challenge those rules as the struggle for recognition continues. So I'm well aware that I've only got a couple of minutes left. So that's an attempt to throw light on Tariq's thinking and to see its strengths and merits through this central notion of recognition. What I do in the rest of the chapter, which I can't do here, is to make, if you click again for me, certain what I'm calling internal criticisms of Modood's thought, Tariq's thought. So again, through each of those themes, I'm asking him certain questions of detail about whether he's thought enough about this particular aspect of his thinking. And then the final click, please. I've also pointed to what I'm calling here limits to Tariq's work. Stuff that seems to bear on or have relevance to his thinking, but which he hasn't yet tackled. And I don't think you're not under any obligation to tackle it because your work is already rich and complex and diverse enough. But there are certain outer limits concerning, for instance, migration, which was already mentioned earlier on. Normally get a fun fair after. But I can't do that here. Please buy a copy of the book. Save 30%, read the chapter at your leisure. I'll say it again. A pleasure and a privilege to work with Tariq all this time. And I really look forward to our future collaborations. Thank you.
Thank you very much.
I've got anxiety, so I might nip out to try and find out if I've left it downstairs.
Enjoying your discreet sharing.
Yeah, the hand projector didn't work. Yeah, are you with us?
I am.
Oh, gosh, my conscience. Thank you very much. Thank you for your patience. I'm terribly sorry we're behind, but it's great to have you. And I'll just introduce you as Jeff Levy, Associate Professor of Political Science at the University of New South Wales, author of many things, including a paper on the Bristol School of Multiculturalism. Jeff, over to you. You have 15 minutes.
Hold on. We need to get a PowerPoint up. So I'll do share screen. Will that work?
Yeah.
Share the screen, yeah.
It's in hand, Jeff.
Okay. Let's see. That's not going to work. How about that?
Yeah.
Can you see?
Yes.
Terrific. Well, greetings, everyone. Terrific to be with you. There's nothing I'd rather be doing at 1:30 in the morning. Let me begin by congratulating all those involved with the Centre on its 25 years. It really is no mean achievement in today's day and age in academic life, that kind of duration. I remember the Centre when it was still a twinkle in Tariq's eye, and I vividly recall receiving with a great thrill the invitation to the inaugural conference back in 1999. In many ways, it seems like yesterday. So let me say and wish the Centre another 25 years of impactful research. And to Tariq, let me just say, Mazel tov on a academic career and life lived so far, because I think we all know it's not over yet, and I fully expect it's going to become even more productive in the years ahead. So to my chapter, titled, as you can see, Integrating Modood and Kimlicka on National Inclusion. The spur to my contribution was a paper that Tariq delivered at Toronto Metropolitan University a few years ago, the title of which you can see there. And in that paper, Tariq's interest was in Will Kimlicka and his colleagues' recent work on national membership and inclusion, some of which Will contributes to the festschrift. And Tariq counterposes in that paper his own approach, multicultural nationalism, with Will's liberal nationalist argument for minority rights. And his main argument is that Will's liberal nationalist theory provides no basis for remaking national identity, that there's a kind of disjuncture between Will's recent interest in national membership and inclusion, according to Tariq, and the inadequacy of his theoretical approach to supporting that interest. And Tariq argues that multicultural nationalism is both more suited to post-immigration ethnic minorities, which is an argument that Tariq's made over many years, but also that it's more fundamental theoretically and more comprehensive theoretically. And it's this because it both offers a direct justification and defense of national inclusion, that's its bread and butter, but also, interestingly, he claims, because it also addresses and redresses the kinds of disadvantages that liberal multiculturalists like Kimlicka and others focus on. And so his conclusion is that multicultural nationalism is simply the superior, the more comprehensive defense of multiculturalism. Now, this debate is even more interesting because the two protagonists to it disagree on whether they even disagree. Will has long argued that he and the Bristol scholars, such as Tariq and Bhikkhu Parekh, are saying the same thing. And to the point that sometimes he even identifies his position as multicultural nationalism instead of liberal nationalism, as he does, in fact, in his chapter in the festschrift. Whereas Tariq has long rejected Will's liberal rights approach in his thin account of national identity, and has always insisted that multicultural nationalism just is fundamentally different from liberal nationalism. Nevertheless, they both agree that multiculturalism should be transformative in distinct ways. In my chapter, I take issue with both their positions on national inclusion. I contend that both liberal and multicultural nationalism are fundamental in their own way and to their own purposes, that they have important points of intersection as well as differences, that each needs the other to offset its own limitations, that an efficacious multiculturalism policy needs both approaches, but also an efficacious multiculturalism policy that promotes national inclusion needs to go beyond both approaches. So what does it mean to say that each is fundamental to its own purposes? In my view, Will's liberal nationalism is primarily concerned with redressing cultural minorities' disadvantage through various kinds of cultural rights. And his expectation and contention is that in doing that, it will extend solidarity and national membership over time. On the other hand, Tariq's primary concern is to arrest minority exclusion and negative difference through broadening the national identity. And his expectation and contention are that in doing those things, minority disadvantage will eventually dissolve and disappear. If one asks, what does Tariq mean by broadening the national identity? It turns out that it means various forms of recognition and accommodation. As you can see, some of these are produced by state intervention, some arise more organically in civil society. And I've highlighted in purple a number of examples that Tariq has routinely called on over the years to illustrate what he means by broadening a national identity. Some, as you can see, involve state endorsement of particular things, such as the inclusive storytelling at the London Olympics, the incorporation of a minority cultural difference within a state institution, such as representing more faiths for religious instruction in state schools, or the reinterpretation of an established tradition, such as then Prince Charles's comment that he would be a monarch in defense of all faiths rather than simply the faith, the Church of England. But if that's the case, if those sorts of measures just rehearsed are what Tariq means by extending and broadening the national identity, it would seem to follow that these measures are pretty similar, if not the same, to the sorts of measures that Will posits or would support as liberal cultural rights. Will's symbolic recognition, for example, would have no trouble endorsing something like an inclusive story at the opening of an Olympics. And while in his early work, he did distinguish between religion and ethnicity in his defense of polyethnic rights, his theory, normatively speaking, is perfectly capable of supporting increased representation of faith communities in religious instruction in schools. And his formal list of polyethnic rights, cultural rights, such as legal exemptions, subsidies, symbolic recognition and representation, all those things are things that Tariq would also, I think, support as broadening the national identity. So in other words, there's considerable overlap in the measures the two theorists would endorse and in fact do endorse. They simply understand these measures as doing different work. But there are also limitations to Will's liberal nationalism. I don't think he's changed his view in his recent work on national identity. It evinces the same concerns about privileging a cultural majority. It continues to insist on a thin national culture and identity. What has changed in the recent work is that now Will suggests defending cultural rights as opportunities to contribute to society, rather than as before protections against the dominant majority. And he has suggested this move in response to recent work and data, which he reports in part on in his contribution to the festschrift, that shows that cultural minorities consistently are perceived as least deserving of welfare support among various nominated groups, and that this undeservingness is itself connected to the majority's suspicion that they're not committed to the national community. So that's the rationale. But there are also several problems with this move, it seems to me. For example, some minorities are isolationist or insular, and they're not particularly interested in making a contribution to the wider society, the Amish, the Hasidic Jews. And liberal multicultural societies ought to be able to accommodate such groups. Secondly, the move puts the onus entirely on minorities and their performance, which seems transparently unfair. And thirdly, it's unlikely to work because majorities typically find new grounds to suspect minorities. This was the great insight of Hannah Arendt in her analysis of the Jewish experience in emancipating Europe. And finally, liberal cultural rights are simply too slim a reed on which to recast a national identity, notwithstanding some effects. And with this, I think Tariq, on this, I think Tariq is correct. And so for this reason, liberal nationalism needs the help, the assistance of multicultural nationalism in attending to those symbolic forms or more symbolic forms and affirmative forms of recognition and acknowledgement of minorities in the community. Sorry. But there are also limitations to Tariq's multicultural nationalism. It involves institutionalizing an inclusive national identity. And that takes time. It doesn't occur overnight. And the expectation that the institutionalization will produce eventually the run-on effects of dissipating and dissolving minority disadvantage will take even more time. So in the interim, even with multicultural nationalism as a preferred model, minorities will need the continued protection of liberal cultural rights. And if all this is correct, the final point that I make, an argument I make in the chapter, is that we also need, therefore, to promote inclusion and belonging as political values in their own right, here and now, in the same way that liberal democracies do with liberty and equality. And I offer some illustrative examples of how this might look at the state and society level. And with that, I cede back to the chair.
Thank you very much, Chair. A model panelist, no trumpets required. So our penultimate speaker in this panel, the final one being Tariq, is Professor Anna Trindifilidou, who holds the Canada Excellence Research Chair in Migration and Integration at Toronto Metropolitan University. It would take 15 minutes to read out Anna's publications and her research grants. So I'll leave it there, Anna, which is a very short biographical introduction for you. But over to you, you have 15 minutes.
Well, thank you, Nasser. Now you're being just too complimentary, and I can say good afternoon to everyone. I'm jealous not to be there, and it's really like I connected halfway through the previous panel, and it almost felt like being there, and I really like the self-reflective tone of the conversation. And what to say, I will also start by talking about how important Tariq has been for me in my work, and how, as he also recently wrote, it's been a quarter of a century and still going, and delighted for that. Actually, Tariq and I think, met at a conference in Milan in 1998, longer ago than we care to acknowledge. And I was not at the inaugural conference, I don't think so, of 1999. I think we then connected, it was probably 99 or 2000, at a conference in Barcelona, where also Riva Castoriano was, who is part of the book. And I still remember Tariq, Tariq and I think you were there, Judith, as well. And so we're walking towards this cafe, and there is Riva, and Tariq says, "Oh, Anna, Riva, here's Anna, here's Riva." And we had an exciting 2 days of conversations where we were discussing about the 90s and the 2000s, and now we are in 2024. And so many things have happened in between. So I think my chapter and even my presentation today is a bit of an outlier, in the sense that I'm not in the field of political theory or the core field of Tariq's work, but I think that probably has been the secret of our long-standing, how can I say, friendship and, intellectual relationship. And I want to actually give credit to Tariq. For me, he's been one of the people that brings reality into political theory. that he discusses very complex concepts and even carries those concepts forward by engaging with very real questions that not only just researchers, you know, sociologists or political scientists, but also the lay people in the street ask themselves. And I think he also very well reflected on that earlier when he was speaking about how, you know, he got from philosophy to, you know, the focus on multiculturalism, and how these, I believe, for all of us are part of our intellectual trajectory, but also part of our biography and our positionality. But I think what I found in Tariq's work very early on is exactly this critical engagement and this capacity to navigate the analytical, the theoretical, and the empirical, and bring the two together. And this is something that I have tried to do as well in my own work, of course, starting from a different perspective, starting more from a reflection on the empirical, on what is happening around us, and then try to think of whether our analytical framework makes sense or whether we need to try and change it. And that is what my presentation will speak about today, and what my chapter in the book speaks about. And I feel that nationalism and migration studies, I entered migration studies mainly through nationalism initially, and there's certainly something autobiographical in this, in that I'm Greek by origin. I grew up in Greece, did my undergrad, and left for my PhD work. And that was the time, that was 1990, so Berlin Wall had just fallen, and there was an unexpected and significant new wave of migration, mostly from east to west, but also east to south in Europe, that was, for the time, unheard of, and that really changed the cards on the table and unleashed a whole set of positive, but also some, I would say, negative or antisocial, you know, transformations. And so my critical thinking at the time and to this day is that sometimes particularly migration studies focus too much on migration and lose the bigger picture. We are not sufficiently reflecting on how migration or migrant integration is related to bigger processes of socioeconomic and also technological transformation. And in that, I'm also indebted to Tariq and also to Simon Thompson, who is there, about their iterative contextualism methodology, which I think is a very good one. And they explain it very well in that article of a few years ago. But it's also something that I think any critical social scientist should kind of try to implement as a way of, you know, developing their work. So focusing on my chapter that has a very long title that reads, "What can migration and national identity look like in the mid-21st century? Transnational diasporas and digital nomads." It almost reads like a summary rather than a title. But let me just say a couple of things about how, like, what has been my reflection. So one thing that really concerns me is technological transformation and how this is changing even the ways we understand our identities, or we participate in politics or in public life, and how we connect with others, both in our personal and social life, but also as researchers and as citizens. So I've been thinking about how migration and mobility are changing. And when I speak about mobility, and I'm not so much part of the mobility term saying that like we're all migrants or we're all mobile now, but rather I'm using the term mobility to refer to on one hand, the spatial physical aspect of moving, which is the core of migration studies, but also speak about digital mobility. The fact that these days we can almost be present, like I am one case in point right now, we can almost be present somewhere else through digital means. And there is a simultaneity and a connectedness that is unheard of. And even the fact, like right now I'm connected from the office, from my laptop, but I could even be on the street on my, cell phone and connecting with you. So this is something that we haven't sufficiently theorized, I think, in migration. And also another element is the individual versus the collective character of migration that I see emerging. So we generally understand migration as something individual, like I move to another country, I move obviously perhaps with my household, or the household is divided. And in the same sense, we understand asylum as I seek protection, or me and my family are seeking protection. but we're not looking at community displacement, which can be at different degrees of forcedness or voluntariness. So whether communities are displaced because their habitats are no longer providing for their livelihoods, or communities are displaced because of ethnic tensions or political conflict. And I haven't fully myself come around to think about that, but I think there is something, even though we all move individually, there is something collective in the way that some forms of movement take place. And that, of course, you know, brings to the many motivations that can you know, are behind migration, which of course can be socioeconomic, they can be political in the sense of seeking protection, but there also can be many factors in between, like environmental, which change the socioeconomic, you know, or natural conditions of a community, and can then prompt, you know, a domino effect in terms of being trapped or actually being required to move. Now, coming back to the theorizing, I had written a few years back a paper about plural and neo-tribal nationalism, and I was arguing that you know, we're confronted with increasing levels of diversity, not least because of, you know, increased transportation, intensification of communications, and so on and so forth. And I was saying, you know, that this can go both ways. On one hand, societies oftentimes become more open and more plural because they acknowledge this diversity, and they acknowledge that you know, the in-group is changing as well. And even if this is often, at least today in Europe, a bit better in North America, it's not acknowledged or celebrated. And at the rhetorical level, it does happen often at the policy level and at the community level. And I think several of you in the room, and I'm thinking of Nasser and Therese, have shown that in your research. But then I have spoken about neo-tribal nationalism and about these knee-jerk reactions of closure and of refusal and rejection of diversity, and, you know, the going back to this idea that there was a time that the national community was authentic and homogeneous, and I'm calling it neo-tribal, tribal in the sense of having this kind of presuming that there is this kind of organic, you know, homogeneity in the community, and neo because it relates a lot to technology and to the possibilities that are afforded by technology. I want there to acknowledge that my sense of plural nationalism is very close to, yes, noted about the 5 minutes, is very much related about Tariq's notion of multicultural nationalism, with a caveat that thinking about plural nationalism, I was not only thinking about internally to the nation, so diversity that challenges the nation from within the national state, but I was also thinking about other, you know, others that challenge our notion of, you know, a national identity from outside. And there I also want to acknowledge the influence of Riva's arguments about, Riva Castoriano's arguments about transnational nationalism. Riva in that work is reflecting on the transnational European Muslim diaspora that has been formed, and, you know, again, reflecting on how sometimes a notion of national identity can be projected on people who are dispersed across the national states. But my thought was also about all the kind of new forms of connections that we see and that are afforded by technology. So I was, again, reflecting, and of course the argument is not finished in that chapter, and it's something that has been, you know, that I have been working on also last year, and I intend to work this year, is how these different modalities of mobility and of presence are affecting our understanding of our national identity. And I was thinking, for instance, about the post-COVID period, and, you know, actually a phenomenon that existed perhaps for academics from a long time, that of transnational families, where, for instance, one parent works and lives somewhere, and the family unit lives somewhere else. Or these days we may even see a family that is based in one country, but the parents work in another country. So I was using the example of someone who works in Brussels, but probably is based in Rome. So they have kind of two bases, and how do we make sense of the identity of these people, let alone of the migration and citizenship, tensions that arise there. Another element was that there's been a lot of noise, if you wish, about digital nomads. And although we know that numerically this is a very niche phenomenon, it is technology that has afforded the possibility for people to do what is called geo-arbitrage. So work perhaps for a company in, say, North America, but then live in Mexico City or live in Thailand or live in Lisbon for that matter. And there has been some interest in terms of how do you regulate this from a policy perspective. Where do these people pay tax? Where do they have their health insurance? Well, are they members of any society? And there is even some work there, and apparently some initiatives of creating this kind of digital nations of digital nomads that will buy their insurance from some insurance provider and will create their digital community that will not be territorially based anywhere. So then my reflection has been on how do we make sense of all that in relation to our analytical concepts. And for instance, also a school of thought that has partly been developed at Bristol, that of everyday nationhood, that was pioneered by Jon Fox, among others, who was talking about how the nation is, reproduced every day through, our processes of inclusion and exclusion that are both institutional, but also very social and cultural. And the question for me that arises, what does everyday nationhood means in the social media era that we're living in? And how this then relates to the more theoretical, ideas that Tariq and the Bristol School of Multiculturalism and Jeff and Nasser and Thomas Seeley are working on. So how do we make sense of our citizenship and of our community membership in such a fluid and technologically connected world? So this has been my reflection. I don't want to take more time, and I look forward to the conversation.
Brilliant. Thank you so much, Anna. I invite you to take the hot seat, and I'll put everybody on gallery. So you'll be framed by all of your fans.
Well, okay, some of them anyway. I mean, some fans and some non-fans. Great. Thank you very, very much, everybody, for being here online and obviously right here. It's a great honor and privilege to have a book devoted to my work by such a group of leading scholars and theorists, which is simultaneously humbling and prideful. So thank you so much to all the contributors and, of course, the editors. I'm really grateful to Simon's chapter and presentation here. He presents in an original way my understanding of recognition more clearly and in a more structured way than I've done myself. He also poses some good questions to me. Unfortunately, I don't know the answer to all his questions. So it's just as well that he thinks that most of the things he has said I could be doing to improve my account are not essential to it. In any case, here I will, as I will in relation to Jeff's and Anna's presentations, to read out what I say in my response in the final chapter of the book, which is entitled From Then to Now, Some Friendly Responses, as it includes a bit of the personal and the friendship, as well as something more substantive. Simon appreciates the central place of the idea of recognition to my multiculturalism, and that I make it do a number of different things. He notes that my point of departure is a distinction which I, perhaps not wholly accurately, a tribute to Charles Taylor between equal dignity, or the politics of universalism, and equal respect, or the politics of difference. I insist that both are essential to multiculturalism, and the latter grows out of the universalism of the former. That political equality is incomplete without equal respect is the distinctive claim of multiculturalism and critique of liberal or classical citizenship. As Simon further notes, this linkage means that I insist that, I quote, individuals always stand in need of recognition, both for what they have in common and for what makes them distinct. He unpacks my uses of the concept of recognition around 4 themes denoted by 4 single words: equality, identity, struggle, and inclusion. This way of structuring what I've written on the subject is most helpful, not least to me, as I learned from this way of packaging what I've said. Simon then goes on to make a number of criticisms or suggestions under each theme. The criticisms are very gently made and tend to be about the need for more clarity or development of an existing feature on the one hand, or about going beyond its existing features to include important matters that are omitted. There are far too many good criticisms for me to respond to all of them here, but let me respond to one of each of these 2 kinds. As an example of internal development, though actually it's a development of a limitation that Simon does not mention, so there are even more limitations than the one that Simon has identified. So an example of internal development is how I have in recent years started asking myself whether majorities, in addition to minorities, can be misrecognized or under-recognized, or may have legitimate concerns about the status of their identities, especially in the context of multiculturalist minority assertiveness and contestations about the nature of national identity. If majorities can have legitimate recognition anxieties, then should not the multiculturalists think about that and what recognition should be due to majorities? This has led to 2 kinds of developments. One actually was present before, but I've come to give it much more importance. And that is that the institutions and cultures of the majority, such as say the English language, probably already entwined with the polity and national identity, should be given normative status. What I mean here is that it should be valued and supported by the state for more than just for functional reasons to do with the economy or for the sake of civic efficiency. French language and literature should be taught in state schools, I mean French state schools, not just because it may be useful for finding employment in adult life, but because it is a constitutive feature of national life. A reason that may be given by a minority nation, such as Quebec, but which I now think can also be given by a country like France. I say that this was actually present in the work that Simon discusses. There I was thinking in terms of the status of the Church of England as an established church. I realized later that I was inexplicit in specifying the conditions on the recognition of majority or national institutions. I've gone on to argue explicitly that even in the context of multi-faith recognition of a multiculturalist sort, the Church of England should continue to enjoy a rightful precedence in religious representation in the House of Lords and in the coronation of the monarch. Such precedence makes sense because on the one hand, the Anglican Church's historical contribution to the development of Britain as a country, but also if it exercises a leading role in the evolution of a multiculturalist national identity, society, and state, as I believe it is doing. The important point is that the second condition is as essential as the first. Simon and I have actually gone on to develop this argument further in relation to the multidimensional recognition of religion, though Simon does not refer to it in his discussion. A related way of approaching the question of majority recognition is to ask whether recognition should be understood as unidirectional or dialogical. That is to say, whether some groups are givers and others just recipients only, or whether all groups are givers and recipients of recognition. I've come to the view that the kind of aspirational citizenship I'm working with must have dialogical and not just unidirectional recognition, which means that multiculturalism is not just about majority recognition of minorities, but the mutual recognition of all groups of citizens and their right to belong to the body of citizens. I believe that these developments only strengthen the importance I've always placed on national identity in a theory of multiculturalism. As a response to one of the omissions in my theory that Simon identifies, I'll say that I am disappointed that despite extensive work I've done on the socioeconomic profiles of the minorities compared to the white British, and in relation to the ethnic penalty and the hidden capacities for social mobility that I've conceptualized as ethnic capital, that despite all that, I've been unable to theoretically connect that body of work with my political theory of multiculturalism. It is not a theme that has been the focus of much work, the connections, what's sometimes called the connection between recognition and redistribution. It's not a theme that has been the focus of much work, and what there is seems to have failed to stimulate me sufficiently to work on the theme. I'll blame myself rather than what other people have written. Simon mentions the case of Nancy Fraser as an integrated theory of recognition and redistribution. I think, however, it has too restricted an understanding of recognition. Fraser's recognition is tied to an idea of status. That is to say, to what society thinks of your group, how it treats you, the status or identity it confers on you. It is thus designed to identify a cultural status as a form of inequality, which in effect is Fraser's understanding of misrecognition, and to connect it to a wider political project of reducing inequalities. Fair enough, good ambition. It can proceed and end without but this is my problem. My problem with this is that it is too external an understanding of recognition. It can proceed and end without an understanding of what the cultural practice in question means. Or to put it another way, it makes the meaning of a cultural practice what the majority thinks it is. For example, if a police force does not allow its officers to wear a turban as part of its uniform, then it is clear that Sikh culture has not been valued. But, so that meets Nancy Fraser's understanding. But it may be that no one else's culture or religion is incorporated into the police uniform either. So there's not a cultural status inequality. All Fraser's concerned with is, as it were, ratios, relativities. Then if no one's cultural practices are recognized and Sikhs are not recognized, well, they're not unequal to anyone else. Or we may say that a police uniform already reflects the dress norms of the majority culture, but fails to incorporate those of the Sikh minority. And that is a form of cultural inequality or misrecognition. So, what would recognition be here? On a status view, Fraser's view, all we need to do is to give Sikh dress requirements the same consideration as that of the majority, and then, go on to connect this status inequality with other inequalities or equalities. The multiculturalist, however, begins with the meaning of the turban, not for the police force or the majority society, but for the minority. Recognition consists of understanding the minority and the place the turban has for Sikhs. A status argument is, theoretically, even if not always in practice, because I think pragmatically, Nancy Fraser and I could agree on certain measures, but I'm saying there's a theoretical flaw in her understanding of recognition. A status argument is, theoretically, if not always in practice, indifferent to minority intersubjectivity and agency and to the minority culture, attending only to what standing it has or is not given in the wider society. Fraser's theory may connect such minority status to other forms of inequality, including those shared by many groups, but it is not a recognition of Sikh identity and distinctiveness, and so falls short of a multiculturalism which seeks to weave minority meanings and respect for those meanings into the larger public culture. If this is so, then Fraser's theory of social justice has no space for my understanding of recognition. A more promising place to start might be Bhikkhu Parekh in his essay in 2004. In fact, in a book coming out of the conference, so he gave the talk at the conference first, in that book, chapter in that book. It is not a systematic theory, but nicely brings out the multiple ways that issues of recognition and redistribution are entwined in practice. I'm grateful for Simon for all his useful suggestions, and am pleased that his conclusion is that my theory of recognition does some good work. It is not flawed, but is limited and could be developed across the important themes it engages with. Jeff Levy and I started conversing on multiculturalism in 1994, and were able to do so face to face or side by side, as one of our favorite modes of conversing is while strolling, as we were in Oxford at the time, but have continued to do so, at least on an electronic basis, on a regular and sometimes very frequent basis, despite only occasionally meeting, given that he left Oxford to return to Sydney quite early on in our friendship. I always learn something from Jeff's astute assessments of different positions, and sometimes have to adjust my own position accordingly. Additionally, his discussions on multiculturalism and the national have been very helpful to me. On the other hand, he has had to put up for many years my telling him why I'm not a liberal multiculturalist, and correcting his interpretations of my position, such that he's not only an expert on that, but has gone on to identify a non-liberal Bristol school of multiculturalism, greatly aiding some of us in terms of our self-reflection as a group, and of course in our profile. This is the backdrop to his chapter and his presentation, where he carefully weighs the competing claims of whether the Bristol School is anything other than a version of the liberal multiculturalism, a la Will Kimlicka. At the heart of this assessment is the role of the national identity or national culture, and to what extent it is taken up as a component of a political program of multiculturalism. He detects some differences between Will and I. For instance, I quote, where Kimlicka seeks to check majority cultural dominance through redistributing solidarity, Modood seeks to check it through redistributing national identity. He offers a very interesting analytical grid We only saw part of it. The chapter is a lot more complex. A very interesting analytical grid for how national membership and identity may be remade and to what extent specific ways are state interventions or society driven. Furthermore, by looking at the recurring examples I use, Jeff comes to the view that I see the state as the major actor and am more likely to want to broaden or reinterpret existing national traditions and cultural practices in order to make them more inclusive rather than demote them from their national standing. He characterizes this approach as top-down. But this is misleading because the culmination of state action is, in my account, often the product of bottom-up political mobilization. In this way, I contrast the lobbying by an independently formed Muslim Council of Britain from peak Muslim organizations in, say, France and Germany, which are formed by the state and so are truly top-down. In any case, Jeff thinks that Will Kymlicka has always favored or has come to favor or could favor within his conception of polyethnic rights all of the measures that I usually hold up as forms of multiculturalizing the national identity. The main difference that he sees between the two multiculturalisms, and it is both theoretically based and has different practical implications, is that he sees liberal nationalism as requiring minorities to change their cultural practices to both be accommodated and to be accepted by the cultural majority as fully part of the nation. While multicultural nationalism is not simply focused on getting cultural practices accommodated, but in changing everybody's understanding of the national imaginary too. Jeff sees that if successful, this makes the accommodation of minority practices easier, but he cautions that this is a slow process, and so the liberal offer of cultural rights, meanwhile, will be essential and may have a lot of work to do. He concludes by cautioning against expecting too much from national identity, which is too amorphous and organic to be an object of a political project, and so it is best to see liberal nationalism and multicultural nationalism as complementing each other in practice, despite their differences in theory. I think Jeff's chapter thus offers both a careful probing into the similarities and differences between Kymlicka's position and mine, judiciously weighing our claims to be distinct and not distinct, as well as balanced assessment and constructive approach to create a successful multicultural society and polity. His strategy of saying that Will Kymlicka's liberal nationalism and my multicultural nationalism are complementary reminds me, in a parallel way, of what I've argued in terms of multiculturalism and interculturalism. So from Jeff, I specifically accept his way of putting it thus, and so this is a quote. Returning then to Modood's claim that there is no basis in Kymlicka's liberal nationalist theory for remaking national identity as far as immigrant minorities are concerned, the assessment must be a yes and a no. The claim is correct at the philosophical level. Kymlicka's theory does not aim to remake national identity as such. However, the claim is incorrect at the practical level. Kymlicka's theory posits various cultural rights that potentially contributes to the remaking of a national identity, as Modood himself understands what it practically takes to engage in building a new identity. So I realize I'm running out of time, but I've just got a few comments on Anna. While I've had some kind of intellectual and research relationship with just about every contributor and editor of this book, I must mention my relationship with Anna. My most international and European Union funded projects have been ones on which she has been the principal investigator. And I doubt if we could have got them funded without her grantsmanship and track record in funding success, which is quite phenomenal. and in which she's enabled me to play a leading role. To the extent that I've gradually developed from being a Britain-focused researcher and theorist to a comparativist, I owe mainly to my collaboration with Anna. The projects would never have been achieved without an intellectual understanding between us and the synergies between our two skill sets. This has been not just a productive partnership, but an enriching experience. It has worked not just because of some intellectual alignment, but despite our having some important interests we have not shared. Anna has led pioneering and extensive research into many diverse aspects of migration and mobility and in varied geographical locations. This is a significant part of her CV, but it's an interest I have not shared, and it has not got in the way of our joint work. Her contribution in this book is an example of her cutting-edge work on mobilities, and given my lack of expertise in this area, I will not comment on it in general. She usefully raises an issue I've not considered: the identity making and identity fragmenting quality of connections of people via the internet, especially connections with people within and outside your nation state, especially in connection with national identity and national belonging, and what resources do some existing theories offer in understanding the phenomena under study. Part of Anna's explanatory approach to understanding the new forms of mobility and migration and the ensuing identity dichotomies that arise is her conceptualization of some of the current developments of nations and nationalisms in terms of the proposed notion of plural versus neo-tribal nationalism. This is the last page. She notes her concept of plural nationalism is very close to my multicultural nationalism, though she's more attentive than me to minority nations like Quebec in Canada and Scotland and Britain, and on the transnational current, while my focus is on thinking about what normative understanding of membership is desirable and feasible, at least in certain countries. For me, this normative understanding centers on citizenship and national identity and their capacity to be rethought and remade from versions which center on cultural homogeneity and interclass cooperation. Basically, the social democratic conception of citizenship of Western Europe from the late 1940s into the 1980s. To those centered on recognition of ethno-religious and ethno-racial difference within a multi-layered, complex sense of common, inclusive national belonging. As I noted earlier, this is a conception of multicultural citizenship that Will Pimlica and I share. And while Anna works with some aspects of current globalization and mobilities that are missing in my conception, she leaves unclear, certainly unelaborated, the normative underpinnings of her plural nationalism. So we both face certain, albeit different, challenges here, and I agree with Anna that the promise of some future collaboration beckons. It may even be that we might find some productive reconciliation between her suggestion of the imperative to look to the everyday and mine, that we first work out what normativity is needed at the macro level.
Thank you.
Thank you, Tariq.
The personnel change to go tomorrow.
Why did you come over here
Oh,
so you
sure.
can share properly? And I think maybe Simon, you should too, maybe. Yeah, because people are going to ask us questions.
So we have we're running a little bit over schedule, but
Yeah, sorry about that.
that's all right. But we do have some time for Q&A before we hand over to John and Tariq for Tariq's valedictory remarks. So, questions? Please.
I'll give it a go. I'm following it on Anna's position here. So we're talking about the the vectors of recognition, moving away from kind of majoritarian, the majority recogniser of the recognised minority, something complex than that. And I'm just wondering, thinking about, you sort of thinking about where would you look for the kind of empirical stuff, to kind of think about, and test out that kind of the possibilities. And I'm just thinking about the realm of civil society and the ways in which you get the kind of bottom-up agency from civil society actors, and kind of evolving those kind of practice. And I think maybe that takes me close to the Anna's everyday kind of experience and sort of thinking through where that provides kind of models or possibilities, seeing that and what that might mean in terms of forming this recognition away from this binary majority-minority kind of relationship. The examples I think of, for instance, my own research would be in the faith sector, where I think there's lots of practices of recognition where you see minorities acting as, for instance, agents of integration through processes of recognition, and that I think offer something a bit more subtle, more complex than that kind of binary understanding. That's a suggestion, but that I think probably locates it in the realm of the everyday, where you're hoping to add more stuff, more normative political theorising into that. But I wonder if it provides a kind of way of empirically thinking through what might be.
Yeah, thank you, Therese. I think we ought to say, because John wasn't in the room at the time, that when Anna was doing her presentation, as she turned to the everyday, she said that she has been influenced, think in this way, by the Bristol strand of think, namely that led by me. So in a way, the question that Therese is asking me is something that John and I have tussled with, mainly in the context of supervising PhD students. So John says, oh yes, this is very important now, you must develop your methodology so we can really unpack what people are doing in everyday practice, what they're thinking, not thinking, and so on. And I'm saying, well, before we can do that, we have to have some idea of what multiculturalism is, some idea of what people's understanding of the national is. You can't understand a big idea, this is my view, you can't, John doesn't share it, you can't understand a big idea like, say, nation, class, even I would say, gender, which is a slightly different kind of concept, just by looking at the everyday. The everyday does embody those concepts, but you couldn't understand that unless you already have some idea of what you're looking for. So sociologists of the everyday, they trade on what you might say are just some general ideas, because obviously they don't necessarily have to turn to theories of nationalism if they don't want to, but we all have, just as, non-academic lay people, citizens, etc., we all have a whole set of ideas, including ideas about the national and so on. So you could just work with those ideas, but those ideas are quite undeveloped. And in fact, this is one of the things that John and researchers like John find, that most people's ideas are quite implicit, underdeveloped, contradictory, etc. So I say, yeah, but what about thinking about these ideas so they make more sense? Ordinary people in their everyday might be acting on them in ways of what you might call low coherence, but there are higher levels, institutional levels, national discourses, and they're not homogeneous, they're highly contestatory and changing and dynamic. But they offer us more coherent ideas that will shed some light on the less coherent ideas of the everyday. So I hope that everyday researchers will want to work with me by saying, okay, tell us the more coherent ideas that will help us to inform a more accurate elicitation from empirical research of what people are thinking of when they're thinking about their country.
John, I think you've got an email coming in.
Yeah, Anna came in.
Oh, Anna. Sorry, Anna, I missed you. I do apologise. Go on.
No, no worries. Yeah, I have a question for Tariq and perhaps for everyone in the room that is inspired by recent developments in British politics, and which relates exactly to this creative and positive tension that there has been between my work and Tariq's work, which is how do we reconcile the normative dimensions of multiculturalism? You said, Tariq, just earlier, and I actually wrote down the phrase because it's a nice, how can I say, response to many people that have come to question, you know, openness and inclusivity. You said we don't look to demote majorities, we look to make them more inclusive. And then later you acknowledge also that difference is complex. What you just said, you know, it's, I mean, we're well beyond the social democratic model because society has changed. So we have, you said, multi-layered complex sense of national belonging. So we are questioning and actually reiterating and reinforcing what multiculturalism offers there. And I do think it offers a lot. But how do we reconcile that? And Britain is a case in point with the migration policy. I personally was appalled. I can't remember if I saw it in The Guardian or in Euronews or somewhere else, that Keir Starmer met Giorgia Meloni from Italy and was considering, like Meloni was saying at the meeting, that the UK will copy Italy's agreement with Albania. And Keir Starmer did not in any way put this into question. He said, oh, we're looking into it. So where, from a normative perspective, where does our concern with the inside stop? And where does our concern of the inside communicate with our concern for what happens in our relation beyond the national multinational state? I don't think we can compartmentalize. I don't have a good answer myself. I'm not, I mean, I very much appreciate Joe Curran's arguments about open borders. I don't think they're realistic. So I'm not even going there in terms of the normative implications, because exactly, I'm very the day-to-day focused. But then the related question, which is also that this inside and outside is changing, and that really, unfortunately, relates to technology, because those who are anti-immigrant and anti-diversity relate very much beyond the national state, and that's perhaps where Riva's reflections are pertinent. There is a level of immediacy that is very, very concerning. And while we should see in technology you know, the seed of more engagement and more listening to the underdog, unfortunately, we see more polarization. So,
thank you, Anna. I'm going to take Dan's question as well, and then I'll ask Tariq to wrap up with the response.
Wonderful. So yes, I've got a question that maybe builds from Teresa's question, actually, just about how do we work with what's missing, or what aspects of your work you haven't engaged with as much. And I thought it was really interesting, Tariq, to hear what you said about how you feel disappointed that you haven't been able to make that connection between political theory work and then some of that more empirical socioeconomic equality work that you've done. And that's a major gap, quite interesting to work on. And it just made me think, where would we look for that, or who could you engage with, or who could others in this room engage with? And one suggestion would be Danielle Allen, the African-American political theorist, female political theorist. I don't know if people are engaging with her already, or
she was a visitor, wasn't she, a couple of years ago?
Oh, well, then the answer to this question would be very easy then. But I just thought it would be great if you could reflect on that visiting moment, because I think her work on democracy without domination brings in some insights, some kind of minority-oriented multiculturalist insights into some of these bigger distribution questions, trying to engage with roles and others. And would I think potentially have been a very interesting conversation to be a part of. So if you've got any reflections from having her here, I'd love to hear about it.
Yeah, so I know we've overrun, I think because we had a longer break when there wasn't even a break in the program. So just very quick responses to conclude the session to Anna and to yourself, Dan. Well, I mean, you said a number of different things, Anna, about things that are worrying and things, how we might bring things together. You said, the phrase you used is, we can't compartmentalize, meaning separate out various things. So there is a very good sense in which everything is connected to everything else. You can never show a disconnection between any two things we care to mention. But of course, we look for meaningful and productive connections. And we also look for distinctness, because we can never analyze any issue if we can't say what the central core elements of it are, what its kind of inner logic is, whether the inner logic is flawed and can be reformed or whatever. So we want to connect everything, but we also want to have clarity of focus for analytical purposes. So one thing that I've done is I have detached multiculturalism from migration. And for a long time, I thought, well, this is just me, but actually it's not. All multiculturalists I now see, very rarely, none of the major theorists talk about migration, because migration is seen as something to do with people who are non-citizens wanting to come into your country. Multiculturalism is all about making sure that none of your citizens are treated as non-citizens or second-class citizens. So that's a totally different analytical problem and, of course, normative. So that's what I would say to you, Anna. Yes, we can't disconnect everything, and people have been encouraging me, Simon just now, to make all kinds of connections. But there are certain things we need to disconnect in order to have a sharper focus and a more coherent, relevant set of ideas about at least one of those things, even if not about the other. And yes, Dan, I am genuinely disappointed. That wasn't kind of just put in there. Every so often, every 3 or 4 years, someone says to me, "Oh, Tariq, you're doing such interesting work, but you're not connecting it to socioeconomic inequalities." And I think, yeah, okay, all right, well, I've done quite a lot of work on this. How can I make this connection? And yeah, I haven't been able to do so. I don't know whether it's to do with ability or I just am driven to other questions. So every time I might be thinking about that, we have the cartoons affair or Cameron saying multiculturalism is dead or whatever. And I'm, like a magnet, I'm drawn to that rather than something else. So we all kind of live with our own obsessions. I certainly have mine. But I'm disappointed that even though I've done, respected empirical work on issues to do with socioeconomic inequalities, and Saffron very kindly referred to that earlier, I haven't been able to bring it into a really coherent and engaged place with a theory of multicultural citizenship. I've done a little to connect, but not enough. I think I better stop at that point.
Well, Anna's put the final word to Anna, which is, I think this tension is something for us to take on the next project. I do feel that we cannot have the values of multicultural citizenship inside and then treat the border as clear, impermeable, and say, oh yes, whatever happens outside is unrelated.
Well, look.
Okay, can I just say that is a normative position, Anna. It may or may not be intellectually coherent. I recognize.
I was hoping to have a segue to Simon.
Your next project coming up.
Sorry.
I think we'll draw the session to a close. I want to, however, say something on behalf of the editors of this volume. Firstly, thanks to the chapter authors. Having authors of Anna's, Jeff's, Simon's caliber contribute to a volume like this is testament to the importance of Tariq's work, his relationships over time, but also it's a lot of work. And I mean, I learned a lot from each of the chapters, and that's not just a plug for the book, there's genuine intellectual worth there. I also wanted to thank Thomas. He can't be here, but I was the first editor for Bhikkhu Parekh's festschrift, and I know full well what goes into being the first editor, and Thomas is the first editor. He led this process from raising money to drafting, prodding Nasser and I when we were being a little bit slow and all the rest of it. Thomas has really done a great service, not just to the volume, but to you, Tariq, and I wanted to make that very explicit. I also wanted to thank Tariq. Without you, there isn't this, and there isn't the community you've helped build, both in front of you, but also online. So thank you very much. I'll hand over to Tariq and John, valedictory remarks, and then the new Tariq. Younger, faster.
Yeah, thank you very much. I know because of time, we have a problem with time, but actually, I was invited, if you remember, those of you who were here before 3:30, you were not that part. I was invited, prompted directly by a question from Catherine, to speak, and I spoke at length. And I said some of the things then that I was going to say now about, my background, how I came to sociology, how I came to Bristol, and a number of other things. And I've got a few others to add to that, but I think they can be said downstairs over refreshments. So looking here at what I should say, what I shouldn't not say, I guess I'll go directly to saying that there are two things which have already been very aired, but perhaps, I should say that I'm very proud of. I suppose the two things I'm most proud of in relation to the centre. And one is the diaspora that it's created. There's already been quite a lot of reference to that. Of course, we have Varun and Nasser here as part of the diaspora of one generation. Then we have Daniel Tahanes, Pierre-Luc. And it is interesting that of the people that are referred to as the Bristol School of Multiculturalism, so few of them are actually still at Bristol. That leads to the second thing that I'm proud of, what Jeff's come to identify as the Bristol School of Multiculturalism. And one of the people who is not just part of a diaspora, meaning he was here and is now somewhere else, but was never here. I feel I would like to say something about him to you all and at this particular moment. And it is something that I actually say in the book, and I think it's just 2 sentences, I'll just read it out. Because you might say, how come Bhikkhu Parekh is part of something called the Bristol School of Multiculturalism? He's never worked here, he never studied here, he's probably only spent a few hours of his life here. So this is what I say. Bhikkhu has been a personal mentor to me, but more fundamentally, I would say that through his theoretical originality, courageous public intellectual engagement, and long public service, and as part of the pioneering generation, South Asians in Britain, He's been not just a model and an inspiration to me, but that he opened up intellectual and political space in Britain into which I and many others could step in. In this way, without ever being at Bristol University, he is foundational to what in the fullness of time came to be the Bristol School of Multiculturalism. And we did give him an honorary degree, partly because of this. We did give him an honorary degree last year, and I was so pleased that we did, because I've been knocking on the door of people originally in Senate House, now at somewhere else, saying, why can't we give him an honorary degree? And we finally have. That's very pleasing. So I thank here a lot of people. I think in some way or other, well, I'll just read the list. Nasser, Varun, Thomas, of course, Erdem, didn't mention you earlier. Thank you for being here, Erdem, as well as everything else. Daniel Dehanis, Pierre-Luc, and Thomas, who is also, you know, his role in the book has just been mentioned, but actually much more than that. He's been a very important and a very important co-author and co-researcher with me over the last few years. In fact, you know, I'm so truly blessed to have so many good younger generation co-researchers and co-authors. In fact, I think 2 generations now I've managed to suck in that kind of relationship. And, you know, that is exactly what I mean when I say the 2 things I'm most proud of are the Diaspora and the Bristol School of Multiculturalism. To wrap up, can't read my writing here. To wrap up, founding and directing the Ethnicity Centre for 25 years has been a great privilege and a very rewarding and productive opportunity with so much interaction and collaboration. I would like to thank everyone who has been involved in this enterprise, past and present. It's been a good long innings. It is therefore with both relief and sadness that I pass the directorship into Jon Fox's capable hands. I promise to let him get on with it according to his own lights and to not be a nuisance. But I will in fact be around. I'm very happy to help and support you, John, as and when you ask for it.
Good. Thanks, Tariq, in more ways than one. When I was coming here, I told Esther what I had to do, and my partner, Esther, some of you know, and her face just turned to stone, and she looked at me, this piercing kind of look, like conveying zero confidence in me. Don't be flippant, you know, and so I'll see how far I get. I'll try not to be. So yeah, so the past, the present, future, all kind of wrapped together here. Being gracious, magnanimous, respectful, considerate, all those sorts of things, you know, traits that you very readily embody aren't on my A list of personality characteristics. So I will try to do my best. And I've been kind of reflecting today. I went back to the office for various reasons and kind of rewrote what I had prepared. I don't think Esther would be any happier with it, but yeah, just kind of reflecting back in the first session on my relationship with Tariq and thinking about Tariq as a colleague, as a friend, and in a weird way, thinking about my relationship with him as his student, something that I think that was only sort of occurred to me in the last couple of hours, which is a bit odd. But let me just say, I mean, so, you know, it's been, I mean, he's been an amazing colleague over the years, 20 years that I've known Tariq now. And I remember, you know, those early days as an early career researcher, sat across his table from him and during PhD supervisions, which you've mentioned. I felt that the students were a bit superfluous to those conversations. I mean, I was so fortunate to have that perspective. I mean, looking back and hearing today about Bristol School of Multiculturalism and other times as well, but today a lot of reflections on that and stuff. You know, that's when it was being built, right? I mean, that's when the foundation was being laid for that, and not obviously just in those conversations, but the sparring that took place in those conversations. I think, you know, I feel that in some odd way, even though I was always pushing back on things, I was building something with you, and as a colleague, that was a really amazing relationship to have with you. And it wasn't just that. I mean, you've always, I mean, you know, if anyone wants to engage critically with my work, I just want to run and hide. I mean, I just want nothing to do with it, right? Tariq seeks that out. He comes and asks for it. He said, you know, that point you raised in the seminar last week about this. And I said, no, I don't remember that. He said, well, you said this, and I want you to tell me more about this. And it just badgers me to kind of criticize him more and more, and until I'm kind of, you know, blue in the face and finally just walk away from it, giving in. But you know, I mean, that's a really unique a unique quality to have as a colleague, to be able to want to listen to other people's criticisms in a very genuine way and to learn from other people as well. And I wish there were more of us like that. So, you know, that's been very notable. As a friend, Tariq has always been there for me, and I certainly treasure his friendship more than anything else. And you know, when you think back, that will be what I remember: the support, the love, the friendship. Those are the things that will be the most important thing to me into the future. Not least of all because I don't really pay attention to the multiculturalism stuff anymore. But no, I'm so sorry. Yeah, you know, just the anecdote. I mean, thinking back, seeing Glenn here, I don't know if you remember this, but I remember when I interviewed for this job 20 years ago in September of 2004, you took me aside during the interview and said, John, you know, no matter the outcome, would you like to come and have dinner with Glenn and me this evening? And do you remember that?
Yeah.
Yeah, and you know, that was a good start, right? I mean, that, you know, so that was day zero of our friendship, and it's built on that over the years. And you know, I mean, yeah, you've been a wonderful friend, Tariq, and I really appreciate that. And then there's the student bit, the new bit that I was just sort of thinking about, and probably too arrogant to think about this in the past in this way. I still feel a bit odd kind of saying it, but I don't see myself as a student of the Bristol School of Multiculturalism in any stretch. Sorry, but I've learned far too much from Tariq over the years not to say that I'm not his student. So I really am your student, but not in a way that maybe you've been more aware of it than I have. But you know, you mentioned Biku as your mentor, and you know, you've been my mentor in a way that you've never made explicit, and I think that's the value of that mentoring, and in a sense that you haven't tried to wave the flag of mentoring. You haven't tried to assign yourself in some sort of hierarchical relationship with me, but you have mentored me over 20 years, and you still do, and you will continue to as well. Yeah, so these are the shoes that I have to step into, and there's some pretty big shoes to fill. It's a hostile takeover, and that I've been very hostile to taking over this.
That is true.
That's true, yeah, only for the last 10 years or so, and remain so. So if anyone wants to talk to me afterwards about a new role, please come and see me. No, it's you know, I think it's challenging. I'm not part of the Bristol School of Multiculturalism, not even the School of Multiculturalism. I mean, it's not my area of research. It's not something that I work in, and you can see how dominant that is, how central Tariq is to the centre. He's synonymous with the centre, synonymous with the Bristol School of Multiculturalism. I am not, right? I feel like, you know, Kamala Harris at the debate with Trump, like, I'm not Tariq Modood. Varen, okay, get it straight. Okay? Twice now, he's called me Tariq. Not having it. So it's, you know, sorry.
In a playful way.
So it's you know, it's a bit intimidating in a certain respect. And I think if I look back on the centre's history, there's the bit that wasn't talked about too much today, or at least not given a name because it doesn't have a name, and that's everything else, right? So there's the center, the Bristol School of Multiculturalism, and then there's everyone and everything else that happens in the center. And that we have been, so I represent the everyone else people, you know, that's who I am in the center. And you know, we've been an integral part of the center, and partially through the kind of sparring that's taken place. We don't kind of cohere as everyone else in some sort of intellectual sense, but we are the residual category of the Bristol School of Multiculturalism and the centre's sort of main interests. And you know, we've been part of that, and I think we've been an important part of that, and we'll continue to be a part of that. So I think, you know, how do I protect the legacy, preserve the legacy of Tariq Modood, of the center, of what it has become known as, and how do I take that into the future? And then I just remind myself, like you said, you're not going anywhere, so I don't have to do that. I mean, I'm the new custodian of the center. The legacy isn't a legacy because it lives on in every day, and I'm sure I will retire before you. So you'll be the next director of the center. You know, so I will be the custodian of all that, but you will protect that legacy, if that's the right word. And as I'm the custodian, you continue to be the heart and soul center. So thanks, Tariq, for 25 years of amazing work.
Thank you very much. So I do believe we have come to an end, though Nasser got to his feet as he was about to say something, but I think we all deserve a drink. And the drinks in the usual place, namely the cafe area outside 2D2. I think everyone knows where it is, but we couldn't get that room because we all know how rooms are no longer available for seminars. You know, anyway, we ended up here. Let's all go down and have a drink. Well, and yes, I would like to say thank you to people I can't see because you were behind my back. Oh, now I've turned my back on you. Sorry, you could see me, I couldn't see you. So I'll just briefly turn around to this profile so that I can see you and say thank you so much for joining us, and of course Jeff and Anna for actually presenting. And Jeff, it must be now about 3 a.m. your time, so thanks so much. And perhaps, you know, join us in a drink in a virtual kind of way, but we're going to switch the Zoom off as we're all exhausted and need some sustenance. Thank you and bye-bye. Thank you. Thank you. Thank you.
No, had one with me.
Yeah.
Over here, so what do
I think it's up downstairs.
I'm gonna take it.
Yeah.
Is Eric cool?
Sorry,
Is Eric
Was it who?
I'm not sure.
Eric Hoffman.
Yeah.
Is it, oh, he called me that? Yeah, I haven't heard that. That's worse than what I've been calling. I've been saying I'm taking over the Tariq Modood Centre.
Yes, yes.